massive door of the restaurant swung open from the inside. A man, scowling like a thundercloud, rushed out into the street. He was dragging a young woman behind him. Their gloomy faces betrayed their spoiled moods. "That's it. I'm not coming here again," he loudly exclaimed. "This used to be one of the best restaurants, and now it's a diner. The food is tasteless, the service is disgusting, and there's a pole in the middle of the room. They've turned a decent place into hell." The disgruntled man helped his companion into the premium luxury car, got behind the wheel, and pressed the gas pedal. "I swear I'll never come back here again." Lister restaurant manager Jack, a lanky guy of about 25, looked puzzled as the couple drove away. They'd lost almost all of their regular customers in the last 2 months since the new owner had taken over the inept management of the place. It's all gone wrong. The attempt to establish a completely new order was crowned with the loss of the most valuable employees, including the face of the institution, an experienced chef, a virtuoso of his work, John Peterson. Even such a devastating effect of unprofessional intervention did not embarrass the boss, but on the contrary inspired further reshuffles and changes. The lover of party life decided to turn a well-known status restaurant into a fun club. After that, the institution fell apart completely, cardinally changed the audience. Revenues fell, as a result of which the salaries of employees were cut, and everyone slowly began to scatter in different directions. Former employees found themselves in demand in other restaurants. They were replaced by people with questionable appearance and reputation. In fact, only Jack and the junior cook Alex, who was now heroically carrying the whole kitchen, were left from the former staff. The guy turned around and with a sigh headed for the director's office. Something had to be decided immediately. It couldn't go on like this. Mike, a young guy, almost the same age as the administrator, sat sprawled in a leather armchair with his feet up on a desk littered with papers he'd been trying in vain to make sense of for weeks, and was frankly fooling around, throwing paper balls into the wastebasket. All these piles of documentation with figures, tables, and abstruse terms were boring him to death. A few months ago, suddenly widowed, Mike had hoped his late wife's restaurant would help him improve his own finances, but the establishment had only added to his problems and headaches. How on earth did his wife Sarah manage this complex machine? Previously, it seemed to Mike that the director's task is only to appear occasionally at work, reminding his menacing appearance to the employees who is the boss of the house, and to withdraw the proceeds. In fact, it turned out to be not so simple. Restaurant business has its own peculiarities and specifics. It is necessary to enter and understand all the intricacies of the case, to keep in tone labor team, to build suppliers, to follow the novelties of the field. A good restaurant cannot afford to go with the flow, otherwise it is bound to drown. You need constant changes, menu, dishes, interior, entertainment program. To the young widower it all seemed boring and uninteresting. Only now he realized what a heavy burden his late wife was carrying. Mike stopped what he was doing, frowned and thought, staring at the ceiling. He remembered the day Sarah had driven her car off a bridge and died. The body, though, had never been found, but in this place of the river was a very fast current, and the investigator did not even doubt the outcome of the terrible accident. The wife had no relatives left. Her father died before their marriage, having had time only to bless the young, and they were married for only a year and a half. Most of their married life was spent in silent misunderstandings and quarrels. In recent months, their relationship has broken down completely. His wife got bogged down in work and did not want to delve into the peculiarities of the easy and free-spirited nature of his chosen one. He hoped that she supported his desire to have fun and enjoy life to the maximum. As he urged her to drop everything and go abroad to the warm sea, where all day long you can sit with a cocktail in a chaise lounge under a palm tree and do not think about anything, Sarah firmly stated that she intends to continue the work of his late father and inherited from him in the inheritance of bank accounts should work for the future, not for living life right now. Suppressing his impulses and desires first to please his late father-in-law, then to avoid scaring off his conservative wife. The young man no longer wanted to live by the rules of this family of workaholics. Mike sincerely did not understand why they should work, if the money is there and the account comes steadily. As soon as his wife started talking about the fact that it would be good for him to do something, he blew his mind. Clubs, parties, hangouts, bright girls, unencumbered by moral standards. The wild nightlife surrounded him in its chaotic, violent dance. Until one day Sarah, in the midst of fun, did not pull him out of another club, tearing him away from a half-naked girl, put him in his car and said it in a tone that does not tolerate objection. "That's it. I've had enough. I'm filing for divorce tomorrow." Mike, leaning back in his seat, smiled mockingly and asked, "Go ahead, honey. File. How will we divide Daddy's inheritance?" Already decided, the young woman looked at him with an annihilating gaze and said in a calm tone, "No, dear. You are as you were with an empty purse, and you will remain so. You deserve nothing in law or in justice. Do you want to lead such a dissolute life? Be my guest, but now without my money." At that moment, Mike realized for the first time that she was right. Without her, he would have nothing to live on. This thought made the man instantly sobered up and immediately found the words to repent. With a pleading look in his eyes, he asked Sarah to think for a while, not to do any rash. For some time the man sat at home, pretending to have come to his senses, and even began to consult with his wife about his future work. Sarah looked at her husband incredulously, but did not speak aloud about the divorce. With pleasure supported his desire to do something useful. And then tragedy struck. At the moment when the police officers on the phone told Mike the terrible news, he was seized by contradictory feelings. Somewhere in the back of his mind he was relieved. Now there was no one to pressure him and control his life. From now on, he was his own master, and after inheritance rights, a rich widower. Justifying his behavior by trying to drown his sorrow, he returned to his former dissolute life. In the club, Mike met a pretty girl, Emily, with whom he once tried to get acquainted back in that debauch period, until he was not nailed by his wife. Emily herself didn't want to date a married man. The guy felt that she was not as simple as it seemed at first glance. He had to make a lot of effort to find out about her. The girl turned out to be the daughter of a local high-ranking official. And then Mike lit up with the idea of getting a wife even more favorable party than the previous one. He literally out of his skin to charm the new chosen one and make a positive impression on the future father-in-law with huge connections and almost unlimited opportunities. From now on, he had no right to make a mistake. Mike put on the image of a successful businessman, an orphaned widower in need of warm family relations. The calculation was correct, and his entrepreneurial spirit was rewarded. Emily gladly took on the role of savior of the unfortunate guy and soon agreed to marry him. But then, as luck would have it, the fine-tuned mechanism of the restaurant began to fail. Even, it would seem, a brilliant idea with the club did not give the expected effect. Everything turned out exactly the opposite. What the hell is this? Money is needed now more than ever, but I don't have long to wait. Wedding's in a month and a half, and I couldn't arouse my father-in-law's suspicion. It is necessary to keep and maintain the image of a serious groom without problems. There was a timid knock on the door, and the receptionist came in. On his face, he looked dejected and depressed. Mike Sergeyevich, I can't go on like this. That's it, I'm quitting, he said in a distressed voice right from the threshold. The owner took his feet off the table and sat down, as befitted a director. It is impossible to let go an employee who is ready to work for pennies. He couldn't do it on his own, and he wasn't likely to find another. What's the matter, Jack? What's the matter? Mike asked with a look of extreme concern on his face. The customers are leaving one by one, he complained. They don't like the new format of the place. They're complaining about the kitchen, and there's only Alex left. He can't do it alone. Mike did not want to be distracted from his dreams of a future cloudless life and deal with this, but the position required it. He had to at least pretend to keep things from falling apart. Well, what is to be done? You tell me, he said. The professional of the administrator scratched his head and hesitantly began. The salary would be added. That's a no right away, the owner frowned, when the club is promoted. Then I promise bonuses and bonuses to everyone. Well then, at least a taster for the cook and an assistant. Alex has gone completely off the deep end. He should gain experience. He's emotional, vulnerable. If necessary, he tries, but he'll have to switch to frozen convenience foods. Where am I going to get these workers for you now? The director asked in a disgruntled tone. He sighed heavily and thought. No, he couldn't ruin the kitchen, because he had bragged so much to his future father-in-law about his successful restaurant that he had allowed him to celebrate his wedding here. Another idea popped into Mike's head. Let's go. He waved his hand at the receptionist and rushed out of the office to the exit directly onto the street. There the director looked around as a pity there were practically no passers-by. The man resolutely approached a couple of girls passing by. Hello, would you like to work at the restaurant? They looked at him suspiciously in silence and hurried away. But Mike was already on a spree when he noticed a woman sitting nearby on a bench, tangled in rags. Johnson shouted to her, "Oh, beautiful. Come here." The receptionist rounded his eyes in horror and whispered in a low whisper, "Mike Peterson, you gotta be kidding me." But he was already on a roll. He loved jokes and spontaneous antics. Not at all. Here's a chef's assistant and a taster all rolled into one, and all for one salary, thought the director and asked the woman who came up, "Will you go to work in the restaurant?" Immediately a new plan instantly matured in his mind. He could capitalize on it and add bonuses in the eyes of his fiancée and future father-in-law on the back of helping the underprivileged. Emily was just as obsessed with the subject of charity. "I'll go." The hobo suddenly agreed, and the receptionist immediately rolled his eyes, not hiding his displeasure. Indoors, Johnson removed her tattered old shawl and outer garments, and before them stood a young girl almost the same age as them, with a short haircut and a rather neat appearance. Her hands were surprisingly clean, and there was no unpleasant odor. The only thing that immediately caught the eye was a rather large belly. The young woman was obviously pregnant. Lyrecker immediately laughed. "Wow, I wanted to take one employee, but it turned out to be two. What luck." The girl said nothing. She just looked down at him. Cook Alex, a tall guy with glasses, looked at his new subordinate with a sigh, but there was nothing to do. There was a lot of work ahead of her. Maybe there was something she could do to help. "Good afternoon. My name is Alex. I'm the cook here," he introduced himself kindly. "And I'm Alina," the girl replied quietly, looking furtively at the giant in the chef's outfit. But they did not manage to get acquainted. "2 or 2 Caesars," shouted the waiter from the threshold, proclaiming the request from the customers. Alex immediately fussed, pulling preparations from the refrigerator with his chaotic and awkward movements. He was confusing himself, grabbing one thing and another. He dropped the food on the floor, took new ones out of the refrigerator, and eventually got lost and forgot what he had done before. Lena, at first silently, watched his torment, then carefully gathered her hair into a bundle, washed her hands thoroughly, and began to quickly chop the ingredients for the dishes. The cook was about to resent the arbitrary interference in the cooking process, but suddenly realized that she was doing everything right, and this help was making his job much easier. "Thank you," he muttered. "Fry the meat in the pan." The girl waitress in the arms of the bartender padded into the kitchen. They were laughing loudly at some joke, oblivious to the fact that the few customers could hear them. The prestige of the place was clearly not taken care of here. When they saw the novelty, they looked at each other and laughed even louder. The red-haired merrymaker threw tears, choking with laughter, wheezed. "I thought Jack was joking, and here it is. That's hilarious." "Yeah, our principal's being weird again." The waitress backed him up from somewhere. "Ernie, what dump?" The employee didn't have enough money for new clothes, but she was proud. Ignoring the rude couple, she began peeling vegetables. Not a muscle in her face quivered under the barrage of their stupid jokes. They mocked a little more, but without any response, they lost interest, quieted down, and went back into. Alex looked pityingly at his assistant and berated himself for not finding the right words and not standing up for. "Don't mind them. They do that to everyone." He tried to smooth things over. "I was bullied, too. They still call me a seal." Alina turned around and smiled sweetly. "I don't mind," she replied calmly. "And why do you allow yourself to be called that? You are a chef, after all." "So what kind of chef am I?" exclaimed the boy in a hearty voice. His chubby cheeks flashed a blush and made him look like a huge bun. Always getting out of hand, stretchy. A real one, he scolded himself. The main thing at home, such masterpieces turn out. Even on the Michelin star application apply. He continued to argue. But at work, it's just a vicious circle. Everything is somehow sloppy and For the first time in many years, he was able to speak out. For some reason, this unfamiliar girl aroused confidence in him. He felt better at once. Such a passionate, sincere tirade touched Alina. Wanted to calm this complex, but clearly a good guy, and help at least with advice. "You're just nervous and not organizing your process correctly," she explained. "You just relax and realize you're the creator here. It's up to you to keep customers coming back to this establishment." The girl looked with a smile at the guy who was listening to her with his mouth ajar, and suddenly went to the door leading to the hall, summoning the cook from there. "Look," she spoke in a low voice, pointing to a couple seated by the window. "There's that fellow and girl you're cooking for just now. There he is taking his companion by the arm and is saying something to her. Somehow I think they are words of love. Aren't they, sweethearts?" she asked, looking back at Alex. "These are your guests. They could have walked into the hamburger place, knowing it's right around the corner. Or they could have just stayed home and ordered pizza. But they came to visit you. Alex, you want to give them a gastronomic treat and put them in the mood to remember this beautiful evening for a long time." The guy, dumbfounded, scrutinized the couple still waiting to order. It was the first time he had looked at his work from this angle. Alina, meanwhile, nodded at the finished dish waiting to be served and offered. Alex, imagine that you are an artist creating a brilliant canvas, and I'll serve you the brushes and mix the paints. The cook liked metaphor. He was suddenly transformed. The stiffness and constant tension disappeared. His body relaxed, and there was a gleam of creative inspiration in his eyes. With quick and precise movements, he assembled an incredibly appetizing salad and fantastically decorated plates with meat. For a period of time and space ceased to exist for him. Alina involuntarily admired the spiritualized expression of his face. After the waiter, having raised his eyebrows in surprise, took the finished masterpieces to the customers with unusual care, Alex twice ran to the door of the hall to observe the reaction of his guests to the dish, in which he had put all his soul, and each time he returned to his workplace satisfied and happy. Now he wasn't afraid of any new order. The fear of screwing up and ruining everything suddenly and without a trace disappeared. The guy was overwhelmed with an irresistible desire to create and share his creative energy with people. The whole evening satisfied waiters, who had received generous tips today, respectfully looked at the cook and passed him words of gratitude from customers. From that day on, Alex didn't have to bear his cross any longer. He flew to work on the wings of inspiration, where a fragile girl with a huge heart and an invariably gentle smile was waiting for him at the entrance. The new girl, with her balanced and malleable character, imperceptibly and easily joined the team. Her appearance in the restaurant unexpectedly affected the whole atmosphere of the place. Between Alex and Emily established a friendly relationship. One day he dared to tell the girl a sad story from his childhood, which left an imprint on the formation of his character. When he was 11, his father left them and went to another family, where he soon had another son. The impressionable Alex got it into his head then that he was the one who was not good enough, since his father had chosen another child. He lived with this bitterness in his soul for several years. Hence, apparently, came the insecurity and low self-esteem. I don't remember my father at all. All my life with my mother lived alone, Emily suddenly confessed. A quiet sadness lurked in her eyes. The young man bit his lower lip nervously and dared to ask the question that had long embarrassed him. "How did you end up on the street?" Emily flinched and looked away. Then she realized, "Oh, why am I rambling on? I have a lot of things to do." Alex realized that the girl was intentionally avoiding the question. The guy didn't insist. Probably. It was a very painful topic for her, just like pregnancy. She'd probably tell him if she wanted to. The appearance in the kitchen of this mysterious assistant had a surprising effect on the young cook. The acquired inner harmony and confidence in his own abilities were transferred from him and the world around him. Now the staff and customers perceived Alex in a completely different way, but the guy knew who to thank for such dramatic changes in his life. Sneaking glances at the calm, concentrated profile of his assistant, he more than once caught himself thinking that he was admiring her as if mesmerized. He was not embarrassed by the young woman's shabby clothes. Her presence somehow excited him in a special way. Even her belly did not spoil the impression. She was as beautiful as a Madonna. More and more often, their silent, meaningful glances crossed. An exhilarating, spring-like mood was in the air. Mike alone was not happy with the positive changes in the restaurant. This strange young woman, whom he himself had invited to work, was now causing him wild irritation. Just today, the manager slid a disgruntled glance at the formerly homeless woman who was peacefully chopping greens. "What are you digging around for?" he shouted at her. "There's a wet floor by the sink. Go wipe it down." or else you'll come back and I'll be responsible for you later," he muttered. The girl obediently took a rag and wiped up the water drops. This silent submissiveness pissed off the young director even more. It was as if she kept getting under his skin on purpose. Mike couldn't help himself from jabbing her in some way as he passed by. The gesture of charity from hiring a homeless woman had no effect, except that good-hearted Emily sincerely admired his noble deed. And so it would be unwise to get rid of the irritant now. He did not like this Emily. He himself could not explain this sudden dislike. Though no, there was one reason. That pregnant Johnson reminded the guy of his dead wife, either in her looks or her movements. He even more than once caught himself thinking that he deliberately mocked and humiliated the new girl, or rather, not even her, but Sarah in her face, wanting revenge for the time when he was forced to submit to his wife and live by her rules. This Emily is certainly doing a good job, and the cook is now praised by her customers. But this similarity of hers brought back unpleasant memories, unsettled and infuriating. But nothing would survive the wedding, get rid of this yoke with all the neighbors, carts and pancakes, sell the restaurant, and forget it as a terrible dream. No, he was born for something else and deserves better. Thinking about the prospects after the marriage made Mike smile. The future father-in-law secretly confessed that he was preparing a surprise for the young people, a big wedding trip abroad. That's where the lawfully wedded husband would work Emily over, convince her to do what he failed to do with Sarah. The new wife is different. She has a soft, malleable personality. Do whatever you want. They'll live abroad, and Daddy will do anything for his beloved daughter. And finally, his dream will come true. Lisa went out of the kitchen into the corridor, and again noticed a strange man with cold eyes and a sports bag in his hand. His piercing stare made her chest throb every time she saw him. He came to the principal's office about twice a week, but no one knew who this visitor was. "I have no idea," Alex answered her question indifferently. "Maybe it's about the wedding? It's none of our business." Lisa disagreed with him. It was unlikely that a man with such an intimidating appearance could be in the business of organizing celebrations. Something was amiss here. And so the wedding day arrived. Mike didn't skimp to impress the future in-laws. That's something he knew how to do. Hired a designer to decorate the venue, 3 more chefs for the evening. The last money went to the host, live music and a huge cake with ornate decoration. Everything was going great. The bride was happily clinging to the groom. The father-in-law, with a shot glass in his hand, was making his 3rd toast, looking favorably at the young. And the guests were noisily having fun, happy to create another family and the occasion to eat and drink. At the moment when the talkative host announced, finally, a short break, Lisa suddenly appeared in the hall. Everyone was busy chatting among themselves. No one paid attention until she stepped up on stage and took the microphone in her hands. "Dear guests, I have an announcement to make," the young woman proclaimed in a calm voice. Mike was even taken aback by such insolence, blushed thickly and growled menacing. "What are you doing up there? You're supposed to be in the kitchen. Get back in there now." "Come on, let her talk," Emily stopped him. "Maybe she's got a congratulatory message from the staff. Let her say it." His father-in-law supported his daughter in the same tone. And Mike bit his lip. To go to the conflict on such a day was unnecessary. And the girl from the stage continued. "Thank you. You're wonderful people. I'm sorry, Emily, that you decided to tie your fate to such a scoundrel as Mike, who ruined his wife's business and now sells here something forbidden in bags." "What?" The groom jumped up from his seat, looking back at his father-in-law fearfully. "What are you babbling about, you fool?" I'd also like, Mike, to say hello to you from the other side of the world." And she pointed her hand at a female figure that had just appeared in the semi-darkness, as if from nowhere. And Mike, as if mesmerized, watched her approach until she came into the lighted place. "Hello, Mike." It was Sarah, alive and well. She stood in the middle of the hall just as he had last seen her, as if she hadn't disappeared for months. The guy's legs gave out, and he collapsed heavily into a chair. How was that possible? All the guests froze, not realizing what was happening. The bride was also confused by surprise and couldn't utter a word. The general silence was broken by the groom's unusually husky voice. "You," was all he managed to utter. "I am," Sarah grinned. "And you weren't hoping to see me after you deliberately damaged the brakes on the car." "That still needs to be proven," he muffled in response. "Of course," she said calmly and looked away. Plainclothes police officers entered the room and twisted the groom's arms. The guests woke up, their excited murmurs traveling through the hall. Some woman shrieked fearfully. The bride and her father jumped toward them, trying to make sense of the situation. "What's going on here? Can someone explain it to me?" nervously shouted the high-ranking father-in-law, spreading his hands in confusion. Just then, an investigator walked in with a confident stride and handed Mike an arrest and search warrant. "You are charged with attempted murder and possession and distribution of a controlled substance in a particularly large amount." Sarah just stood there and watched the whole action aloofly, not realizing how she had gotten to this point. She thought back to where it had all started. For as long as she could remember, it had been just the two of them living with her dad. Her father was an interesting, prominent man and wealthy. He had a lot of women hanging all over him. He had the occasional brief fling. But he never brought anyone home and never formally introduced his daughter. He lived by his own principles and rules and did not tolerate anyone telling him what to do. He told about his mother sparingly and reluctantly. She had long ago died suddenly. For the sake of his daughter, he was ready to do anything. Sarah studied in the best school, was an excellent student activist. From the first grade was at the same desk with a modest boy, Nick, who until graduation carried her briefcase and threw admiring glances in her direction, although never once admitted to sympathy. During her school years, the girl got used to seeing her neighbor as a loyal friend. It did not even occur to her what strong emotions raged in his soul. Only after graduation, escorting Sarah to a foreign university, which sent her father to learn the features of modern economics, Nick, timidly stammering, confessed his love. Sarah was a little surprised, smiled, and hugged the guy in a friendly way, letting him know how she felt about him. Both of them felt awkward, and since then they practically didn't talk to each other. Studying abroad was easy for the girl, but nostalgia for her native home did not let go. She missed her father terribly. She was ready to break away and leave at any minute. That's when she and her father had their real fight. The first and last time in her life, when Sarah decided to return home after graduation, against his wishes. She couldn't stay there anymore. She didn't like it. The air wasn't the same. The people were strange. Her father wanted her to live in a country with a developed economy. He thought it would be better for her. But Sarah didn't want her fate to be decided for her. She came, put her international diploma on her father's table, and firmly declared that she wanted to live here, next to him. After such an adult and clear declaration of intentions, the man's heart finally calmed down when his daughter agreed to head his pride, the best restaurant in the city. It was during that period, as it seemed then, quite by chance that Sarah met Mike. Tall blonde guy shone with manners and tried in every possible way to charm the chosen one. He never left her side. Now she realized that she didn't know Mike either before or after the wedding. The cunning fellow had changed his coloring to the right one in an effort to please. It hadn't alarmed her at the time. It amazed her how much they had in common: interests, music, books, movies. Coincidences like that don't just happen, she thought. This meeting was no coincidence. Mike was the one for life. By that time, her father was already very ill and did not hide his desire to find his daughter a worthy party, so as not to worry about her future. Mike managed to brainwash him too. Giving his consent to the marriage, the man immediately as if relaxed and stopped fighting for life. It wasn't long before his soul was gone for good. With Daddy's death, his daughter's world turned upside down. Sarah was so used to him always being around. You can at any time come or call to share joy, or conversely to cry, just to hear his dear, loving voice. Dad always had time to talk to his daughter. After waiting a few months, the groom began to persuade Sarah to formalize the relationship. Moll, this is the last will of the father. The girl agreed, and they just quietly signed. Without celebrations and festive fuss, Sarah went to work. She wanted, in memory of her beloved father, to make even better his child, in which he put his whole soul. She thought about opening 2 more such restaurants. In her dreams, she always saw her husband as a reliable support, not once asked him to join the family business. But Mike was changed after the wedding. Now he was living the high life. He spent his wife's money left and right, taking everything he could from life. I'd heard about her husband having fun on the side. Sarah at first was hard to get over, then just angry at herself for having made a mistake in a man. And when the woman caught her spouse drunk in the smoke with some girls, decided to divorce, which immediately resolutely told him. The whole world finally crumbled into small pieces on the day when Sarah and his car went to a new supplier out of town. The memory of that unfortunate accident made her shudder. She only remembered depressing the brake pedal as she turned onto the bridge, and feeling the pedal suddenly fall easily into the void. Sarah lost control, and the car sped down the steep slope toward the river. Time slowed to a crawl. The girl looked with horror at the smoothly but inevitably approaching edge of the cliff. Fear squeezed her heart and stiffened her whole body, making it impossible to move. Well, that's it, flashed through the girl's mind. A strong blow of her chest and head against the steering wheel knocked her out for a moment from the sharp, piercing pain. She woke up already in the river. The cabin was rapidly filling with water. Sarah, unaware of her own actions, jerked the door open. At the last moment, she managed to slip out of the car, which immediately went down. The current swept up the unfortunate young woman. Panic, terror, and fear of following the car into the dark abyss made her struggle. With her last strength, she tried to stay afloat, paddling, and paddling. The next thing she knew, her mind was a blur. There's no telling how long she was adrift. She only came to her senses when someone shook her violently by the shoulder, trying to bring her to her senses. Chills ran through her entire body. It was wet and cold. Sarah groaned. Her voice came out weak and hoarse. When she opened her eyes, she saw a young girl's face that looked familiar. When she looked around, she realized she was lying on the riverbank in wet clothes, covered in silt. Apparently, she had just been pulled out of the water. "How are you feeling?" the stranger asked and leaned over her concernedly, peering into her eyes. "Terrible," Sarah whispered with naughty lips. She was indeed experiencing an excruciating headache. It also felt like everything was fractured, especially in her chest. On top of that, she was shaking with chills. It became unbearably cold. "My name is Lisa, and you are?" The girl introduced herself. "Sarah," she replied in a weak voice, and then suddenly asked, "Have we never met before?" Lisa shrugged uncertainly and asked, "What happened to you? Can you walk?" But noticing that the rescued girl was feverish, she ran for help. In just a couple of minutes, she brought a neighbor, a big man with stubble on his broad face, who picked up Sarah in his arms, as if she was a flake, and carried her straight to a small house nearby. Lisa took off her wet clothes and laid her on an ancient metal bed with a huge, lush feather bed and covered her with 2 down comforters. Sarah watched her savior through half-closed eyelids and could not remember where she had seen her. Lisa was thinking the same thing at the same time. A strange sense of déjà vu had seized her at the first sight of the unfortunate girl's pale face, and hadn't let go until now. Walking past the large mirror hanging on the wall, she suddenly stopped and looked at her reflection. Suddenly an epiphany came. Of course, that's where this incomprehensible feeling came from. It was just that this Sarah was strangely similar to herself, to Lisa. Once in bed, the rescued woman seemed that she fell into a warm, thick cloud, carefully embraced her soft, fluffy edges. It became warm and cozy. The pain dulled. Her eyes closed on their own, drawing her into a heavy, restless sleep, where she was again endlessly falling, sinking, and floating. A quiet conversation was heard through the dream. "Mitrofanovna, won't she die? Shall we call a doctor after all?" A familiar voice asked anxiously. But that would have caused resentment. "Who else? Why did you call then?" "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to offend. I'm worried about her. She's very pale. She's been feverish for the last hour." Sarah opened her eyelids with difficulty, and through the fog noticed that it was late evening outside the window. Mrs. Adams appeared to be a small, gaunt old woman, clean and neat, wearing a white shawl, as if she had just returned from a church service. She must have been the local witch doctor. Sarah didn't trust alternative medicine, but she liked this grandmother. There was an inexplicable pleasant aroma coming from her, something between the smell of incense and a bouquet of wildflowers. The old woman ran her hands over Sarah's body, then felt her chest and head, causing a sharp pain. Then she said, "It's all clear here. Severe contusion to the chest and head. No fracture, I think. In the evening I'll brew you some herbs to drink and apply these compresses. Don't worry. Everything will pass very quickly." The healer was silent and then frowned and said, puzzled, "There's more." She looked back at Lisa and commanded decisively, "Come here. Give me your hand." The girl stretched out her palm in surprise. The old woman clung to it with one hand and took Sarah's palm with the other. Suddenly she froze, looking at one point and muttering something under her nose. After sitting like that for about a minute, Sarah opened her mouth to call out to the witch. Why, maybe she fell asleep. Quietly, she's old. But Lisa rounded her eyes meaningfully and put her finger to her lips, indicating that she should keep quiet. The old woman finally came out of her trance and linked the girl's hands together. "Do you know you are sisters?" she suddenly asked. The girls looked dumbfounded at Mrs. Adams and then at each other. "What? What do you mean?" came out of Sarah's mouth. The old woman shrugged. "I can see that you are sisters and separated at an early age. I'm never wrong. I was shown such a picture from there." "From there?" Stunned, Sarah asked. "From there," the witch repeated carefully and pointed a slender finger upward. Everyone fell silent, digesting the information they had received. Then Sarah shook her head confidently and said firmly, "No, you just saw that we looked alike in some way. No, my father would have told me." "That can't be true." "It can," Lisa, who had been watching the rescued girl breathlessly the whole time, suddenly said. Everyone stared at her, waiting for an explanation, but she was visibly nervous. Then, finally, having gathered her thoughts, told everything she knew. Lisa and her mother lived all their lives in this small house. Growing up, the daughter began to ask questions about her father, but the mother only waved away and kept repeating the same phrase, "Father so-and-so abandoned us and left." Her mother worked as a school teacher and gained a reputation as a strict woman. She treated both her students and Lisa equally harshly, giving no one a hard time. School children even did not hide their dislike of the overly principled teacher. The girl was offended to listen to all those epithets which they awarded her mother. She still loved her mother and knew for sure that she loved her too. It's just that she never tended to her and always demanded to the full. But Lisa believed that thanks to this she was good. The girl graduated from school with a gold medal and followed in her mother's footsteps in the teacher training institute. True, thanks to a softer character of nature, she formed a completely different approach to children, for which she has repeatedly fallen from a more experienced mother. After listening to her arguments, Lisa stubbornly continued to bend her line, considering her own method more effective. Unfortunately, excessive straightforwardness and professional deformation served her mother badly. Once she went to the city and missed the train, she had to wait for the last one almost at night. Eyewitnesses said that the woman began to make harsh remarks to some drunken company at the station. They did not hesitate to beat her to a pulp. Lisa remembers well how she arrived at the hospital and entered her mother's room. She could not recognize her at first, and then sobbed at her bedside for a long time. Her face was covered in bruises. Her right arm and collarbone were broken. But most importantly, these scoundrels had managed to break the woman's spirit. They trampled her faith in light, good faith in truth and humanity. The woman simply did not want to live any longer and felt that she did not have long to live. Before she died, she told about Lisa, about her father. The parents met very young and fell in love with each other at first sight. It was like a lightning strike. A bright, passionate romance ended in a quick wedding. Surrounding people could not understand how two people with such a stubborn temperament and explosive character decided to link their fates. Two representatives of the fiery element tried to get along together, and for a while they managed it. With the appearance of twins in the family, the young father seriously thought about the future. He had grandiose plans, but in a small village he did not see any prospects at all. Unfortunately, he could not persuade his wife to try her luck in the big city. She decided to stay to work in the local school. No arguments, persuasions, and ultimatums could not change her choice. Over time, the young couple completely ceased to understand each other. Each insisted on his own. More and more often they quarreled, and then defiantly remained silent for several days. A real scandal in the family broke out when 2-year-old girls accidentally poured ink into the drawer with documents in the desk. The parents, seeing that all passports, birth certificates, and notary papers were irrevocably spoiled, were horrified. But they reacted in different ways. The mother wanted to punish her daughters in her heart, but the father categorically opposed it, trying to prove that they were too young and did not understand anything. But the woman stubbornly insisted. In the heat of anger, she shouted that she was a certified teacher and she herself knows how to bring up children, that she would do without him in this matter. The conflict grew. Mutual reproaches from both sides were sprinkled. Long-buried resentment spilled out. In fury, the wife threw her husband right in his face. "My children do not need such a father. What can you teach them, loser?" The man couldn't bear the hurtful words. "All right," he shouted. "Since that's the case, I'm taking one daughter and leaving. We'll see who raises the best." "Ah, so? Well, go away then. Do you think I'll cry? We'll live just fine without you," she shouted hysterically. By unspoken agreement, her father took Sarah, who clearly favored her father, liked to spend time with him and sit on his lap. Lisa increasingly squirmed around her mother and, accordingly, stayed with her. This is such a silly principle of unbalanced and stubborn parents separated the sisters. Lisa could not believe what she heard from her mother. But also to bark and question her in such a difficult condition, she could not. For the first time in her life, the daughter saw in the eyes of the Iron Lady tears. Soon the mother was gone. The sorrow tore her heart to pieces, but the thought of her father and sister did not give rest. Lisa even tried to look for them. But the mother after the divorce left herself and her daughter her maiden name. She never had time to give her father's information. Sarah listened, holding her breath, and followed her sister without taking her eyes off. Her soul suddenly opened a secret door and let in the missing puzzle, which was immediately built into the empty space of the inner world. An epiphany had come at last. This was what had plagued her all her life. A sense of something missing, something long lost, something with which there was still a vague, invisible connection. Another soulmate. It's an incredible story. It just didn't make sense. The things their parents did when they were young. And for what? To prove something to each other. And what could they prove in the end? These heavy thoughts finally deprived the girl of strength, and she closed her eyes in exhaustion and fell on the pillow. Sarah was more concerned with other things now. She didn't even doubt that the accident had been arranged by her husband. It was not for nothing that he had said the day before that he had put his car in for service and had taken her car to go somewhere. He'd been tense all evening after his return. But what's next? How to prove it was his doing? To return home now was to expose herself to the danger of another assassination attempt. Anxious thoughts completely consumed her mind, and the girl herself did not realize when she fell asleep. Something heavy, but very warm and soft warmed Sarah's chest. Through her sleep she reached out her hand to free herself from the heaviness, but fumbled with a large, hairy, living creature. Immediately frightened, she pulled it away and opened her eyes. Right in front of her face she saw the cat's huge, shiny green eyes. Nestled on her chest, the bright red-haired beauty looked at her with genuine surprise. "What on earth were you afraid of?" "It's me," Lisa's voice came from nearby. "Piggy, leave Sarah alone. You better go eat." The cat slowly got up and went to the kitchen with a sense of dignity, trustingly pressed against Sarah's side in farewell. A smiling Lisa entered the room, wiping her hands with a towel, and asked, "So how are you? Sorry, the frosting didn't make it. But it's even good that you had it lying around. They say cats can heal." Sarah moved. Her head and chest did hurt less. Maybe it was the effect of the wine she drunk before bed, or maybe the merit of her new friend Marusi. In any case, the rescued woman with difficulty, but still was able to get out of bed on her own. Lisa carefully supported the girl, took her to the bathroom, and then sat down in a comfortable chair in the kitchen, where her mother used to like to stay up late checking students' notebooks. The girl had already managed to fry puffed pancakes and make tea. Sitting across from each other, the girls ate breakfast. They didn't know how to start a conversation. Yesterday they had never managed to talk, and today there was an awkward silence in the air. A cat came up and began to rub its fiery fur affectionately against one girl, then the other, as if to encourage them to start talking. They laughed, and then, looking at each other and realizing that they were thinking of the same thing, they laughed heartily, and the conversation succeeded in getting started. The tense atmosphere was instantly diffused. "Marusha recognized you," Lisa said, gently looking Sarah straight in the eyes. "Actually, she hides from strangers. So you're her own." The latter smiled and replied, "I'm really glad I have a sister." Now they looked curiously at each other's facial features, noticing with pleasure that they had much in common. New feelings unavailable to them before stirred their souls and encouraged them. The joy that they now had another family member who would not betray them, who would always support them, who simply existed. Sarah, in turn, told about her life and initiated her sister into suspicions about the intentions of her negligent husband. Lisa frowned and shook her head sadly. What a scoundrel, she then thought, and asked her sister what to do next. "Is there any way we can follow him?" Sarah sighed. Who would do that? He'd recognize me right away. "Let me do it," Lisa suggested with burning eyes and continued, noticing the girl's incredulous look. "Why? While school's on vacation, I'm free as the wind. I'll change into rags. I played Baba Yaga at the New Year's matinee. I'll play a bum. I can also make a pregnant belly out of a pillow to make it more natural." Sarah did not want to agree to such an adventure. She was afraid of putting her sister in danger. Time was running out. There was no other plan. After 3 weeks, Lisa finally managed to talk her into it. The raid went pretty well. The new Johnson was able to find out something about the restaurant's heir. After that, they devised a plan. Lisa would keep an inconspicuous eye on the restaurant under the guise of a vagrant. But with Mike's light hand, she suddenly got a chance to observe Sarah's husband from the inside. Returning late at night from her new job, her sister was happily recounting all the details of the day. But Sarah had a very different reaction to such news. "You're not going there again," she declared. "Why not?" "Everything is working out so wonderfully," gasped the sister. "Don't you understand? I don't know now what's in that man's head or what else he's capable of." Sarah was silent for a moment and added quietly, "I don't want anything to happen to you." A tear suddenly glistened in her eyes. Lisa hugged her sister and reassured her, "You're my darling. Everything will be all right. The main thing is that we are together now." Having embraced, the girls sat for a long time, discussing further actions. Then Sarah suddenly remembered her school admirer Nick. One of her former classmates had once said that he worked as a police investigator. It all came together in her head. Someone who could really help. But all previous contacts were lost along with the phone drowned in the river. That's the reality of the modern world. Nobody trains their memory or memorizes phone numbers by heart like they used to. Sarah was still weak, and she was not allowed to be in the city. But the sister managed to find a young investigator, Peterson Nick, surprisingly quickly to send greetings from a former classmate. It was impossible to tell from his facial expression whether he was happy to hear from his first love or not. But judging by the fact that he had rushed to the small village, many kilometers away from the city, that evening, he cared. "Nick, is that you?" the girl exclaimed, barely recognizing in the older, broad-shouldered man the same hesitant, skinny side that had walked her home from school. He smiled embarrassedly, stepping closer and taking Sarah's hand. Looking into her bottomless eyes, he thought they had become even more amazing and alluring. The old love that had been buried deep in the depths of his vulnerable soul at a young age had awakened, and spreading its wings, burst free. Unlike Sarah, he never lost sight of his former classmate. All the last years he knew about her imminent marriage right after her return from abroad, and after the news of the death of a few months he did not let go of depression, until the department did not show up as a messenger Lisa. Nick and Sarah talked until the night. First, they discussed the accident and the operation on the future resurrection of the girl, then just warmly remembered the carefree youth. Now the admiring look and warm, caring hand of the school sigh, gently squeezing her palm, was perceived by the girl quite differently. The extraordinary energy emanating from him enveloped her in a blanket of serenity and calmness. How stupid she had been before. She was looking for true love somewhere far away. She was falling for Mike's charismatic appearance and tongue-in-cheek, when a real loving man was always unobtrusively looming nearby, ready to help at any second. Nick conducted an examination of Sarah's car, which with difficulty managed to find 200 meters from the site of the fall. The suspicions were completely confirmed. The brake cylinder was deliberately damaged, which led to the failure of the braking system and the accident. Surviving as a spy, Lisa, for her part, quickly realized that everything is not so simple in the new club. The observant girl, to whom no one else paid attention, was able to find out that Mike, trying to replenish his wallet, got in touch with the drug mafia and began dealing in substances. She was even able to determine when there were deliveries of the goods. The dealer turned out to be that suspicious stranger. The last shipment was on the eve of the wedding. But Nick had to risk his career to conduct a detention at the wedding of a high-ranking official. But everything went exactly as planned, After the discovery in the director's office of a large batch of white powder, Mike confessed to everything. Instead of a spa vacation, he was now facing a long prison sentence. That's what happens when you start using the worst means in pursuit of a carefree life. The sisters couldn't stand it any longer and rushed towards each other in the street. They laughed through their tears and hugged each other. They hadn't seen each other for months, only calling each other all that time. First, Sarah and Nick went on vacation on their wedding trip. Then Lisa had gone to another city with Alex, who had been invited to participate in a television cooking show. Then work issues constantly distracted both sisters, and there was never time to meet. During this period, they missed each other so much that they agreed to live next door to each other. They vowed never to be apart again. As she hugged her sister, Sarah suddenly pointed to Lisa's small belly, visible from beneath her open coat. "Are you acting like someone else again?" Lisa laughed merrily and replied, "Now I'm impersonating a mommy-to-be. It's going to be twins, by the way. They said yesterday at the ultrasound." Sarah looked at her sister fondly. She leaned over and whispered softly in her ear, "Just don't ever separate them." Lisa smiled sadly, understanding her half-heartedly. She hadn't realized before what a miracle it was to have a sister. It's a special, inexplicable attitude. It is friendship and reliability and support and love. They can be characterized by only one all-encompassing and most valuable word: family. No matter what happens in life, sisters and brothers must stick together. As she stepped out of the shower, Vivian heard the voices of her husband and mother-in-law in an unfamiliar language, barely understanding the. Vivian Smith stood next to the high panoramic window and looked thoughtfully into the distance, where in the depths of her and her husband's large and blooming garden was a beautiful little lake, in which huge rainbow carp were slowly swimming. "Here, Vivi, look how beautiful they are," Stephen said, hugging her. "They were bought especially for you, so that you could come here at any time and watch our family in miniature." Stephen smiled and pointed to a pair of beautiful fish moving smoothly beneath the glass like water column. "Look, the bigger one is kind of like me," he continued. "And this beauty with shimmering sides, this is you, Vivian, my female, my lawful wife. See how happy they are, just like you and me. It's not for nothing that we have a name that speaks Smith." Vivi looked at the majestic fish for a long time and thought that now she too was swimming in the middle of the unknown of her own life. And just like these carp, she could not remember herself. The woman slowly shifted her gaze to her reflection in the window. She was tall, almost model height, slender like the trunk of a birch tree. Vivian had a truly beautiful appearance. The platinum blonde, who had turned 25 last year, looked as if she had stepped straight from the pages of a fashion magazine. However, Stephen said that's how they met. Mole, she was a model, about to finally leave the business, and he a successful banker, whose management was several branches of one of the largest banks in the country. Her husband told her that they had met at some art exhibition, either devoted to Impressionism or vice versa. It was something related to handicrafts. Stephen said he couldn't remember exactly anymore. "I wish I could remember any of it," Vivi thought to herself bitterly. Anything at all. However, no matter how much the businessman's wife strained her memory, no matter how much she tried to reconstruct the events of that fateful day, when she was in a terrible car accident and almost completely lost her memory, she could not remember anything but her name. Her first memory, after she finally regained consciousness, was a long road home. The woman remembered the cozy interior of an expensive car, in which her husband drove her to their luxurious country mansion, which stood in one of the most closed and carefully guarded cottage villages. Next to her in the car sat a middle-aged woman, dressed in a chic three-piece suit of sky blue color. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her makeup would be the envy of the Queen of England. The lady looked to be about 50, but she had a figure like Hollywood stars, trim, slim, with a minimum of wrinkles on a beautiful, but a little cold face. It was later revealed that this was Stephen's mother, Cindy Smith. The banker's mother owned a large spa complex, so in matters of youth and beauty she really had no equal, at least in their town. Already after they arrived home, Stephen and Cindy told her in more detail about what had happened to her. "Honey, it's normal for you to feel a little lost," her husband explained to her. "That accident you were in with your driver was just horrible. The driver was killed on the spot. And you..." Stephen hesitated, as if it was hard for him to talk about it. And he did not know how to choose the right words not to shock his already confused wife. "Vivi, you were literally in pieces. Your brain was severely damaged, and after the doctors conducted several complex operations, you had to be put into an induced coma. You wouldn't have survived otherwise. Dear Mayor." Cindy, who was sitting there, lowered her eyes silently and put her palm to her forehead, as if she were suddenly sick with worry for her sister-in-law. "You've been in a coma for almost 6 months," she said quietly. "My son visited you every day, hoping that your condition would finally improve enough to wake you up. But the doctors didn't give a positive prognosis at first. They said that the chances of your recovery were slim to none. You did it, Vivi. You beat death. You did it." When Cindy looked at Vivi again, there were tears in her eyes. She immediately walked over to her sister-in-law and gave her a sincere hug. Vivi had no choice but to reciprocate the gesture with a much smaller hug of her own. "I've been waiting for you," Vivi said, Stephen, wiping tears from the corners of his eyes. "You don't know how long I've waited. Mom is right. Even the doctors were desperate, but I still believed. I believed you'd come back to me. Sweetheart, thank God you did. You're home now. And I'll never let you suffer again. Never again." The young woman looked at her husband, and for a tiny moment it seemed to her that she had heard something like that before. But it had been under completely different circumstances, and what they were, she did not remember. Vivi felt as if she'd been asleep for decades, and when she woke up, she found herself in a completely different time and place than where she had fallen asleep. The woman was haunted by a constant feeling of lethargy and physical weakness, and everything around her seemed completely different from what it was supposed to be. Thank you both," Vivi replied slowly, and her mother-in-law finally released her from her overly strong arms. The young woman smiled weakly at her and her husband, and added, "I must be very lucky to have such a sensitive and caring family. I will try to remember you and everything that happened before this terrible accident. I promise." Cindy and Stephen gave a quick glance. But in the next second, a happy smile flashed across the faces of her husband and mother-in-law. "Of course, darling," Cindy sang out, taking her hand. "We don't doubt it. Stevie will help you fill in all those gaps in your memory after the coma. We've done a little bit of preparation for this, to be honest. So as soon as you're fully ready to get started, just let us know. Okay?" And Vivi nodded and asked abruptly, "Are you living with us?" Her mother-in-law was stunned for a moment, as if she hadn't expected her daughter-in-law to be so tactless. But then, realizing that it was just an ordinary question, Cindy softened. "That's right, honey. Me, you, and Stevie all live together in this lovely house. I'll keep an eye on you, if you don't mind," she said, looking at her sister-in-law carefully. "Stephen is at work all day long. Besides, he's often sent on business trips, even abroad. I think it's for the best." Vivi shifted her questioning gaze from her to her husband, and he confirmed her mother's words. "Darling, you have absolutely nothing to worry about. I'm taking a little vacation now, but I'll have to go back to the office in a couple of weeks. I want to be absolutely sure that nothing will happen to you while I am away. My mom has graciously agreed to help me with that, even though she too has more than enough worries in her complex. I'm sure you and Mom will have a great time together. You two were thick as thieves before the accident. Real girlfriends." Stephen laughed a low, clean laugh looking at his mother for support. It wasn't long before Cindy laughed too. Of course, we'll talk about so many things, cook so many delicious meals. You won't be bored, that's for sure, her mother-in-law patted Vivi's hand gently. But Vivi felt that the woman did it a little too playfully, as if she were exaggerating their friendship. The husband had obviously embellished the true state of affairs between Cindy and her sister-in-law. Anyway, Vivi didn't say anything at that time, but only gave her loved ones another weak smile. She was indeed very tired, and the only thing she truly wanted badly at that moment was to just sleep. Her relatives didn't resist Vivi's wish and took her to the room designated for her. Nearly a year had passed since then, but the young woman had made no progress in her many attempts to remember her life before the accident. It was as if someone had deliberately separated the two halves with an invisible line, and everything that had gone before was irretrievably lost. Her husband helped her as much as he could, showing her the wedding album, which contained a lot of photos of the celebration itself and afterwards from their daily life. Here they are, happy and insanely beautiful, posing for a photo surrounded by 24 of Vivi's friends. A gorgeous designer dress the color of melted milk, fully embroidered with silk and silver crystals, which are folded into a whimsical and slightly reminiscent of Scandinavian ornaments. "You look so beautiful here," kissing his wife, Stephen whispered. Vivi only smiled softly. She was not yet ready to get as close to her husband as he would have liked. Too little time had passed, and she had not yet had time to get used to him or to feel the feelings that had bound them together, as he claimed, for 3 long years. "I'm sorry," Vivi said softly. But it was as if her husband didn't hear it, as he continued to try to communicate with her more closely. He tried to hug her, but the woman pulled away more insistently. "No, Stevie, please, I can't." "But I love you," Stephen answered her sadly. Vivi realized from his face that he had been waiting for this moment for a long time. Now all he could do was look disappointedly back at their wedding photos. "Okay," he said dryly. "But did you remember anything? You can't hide from me forever. After all, I am your husband. You don't need to be afraid of me. Maybe if we started living together again like we used to, you would sooner be able to not only remember, but also feel the same love for me that I feel for you every day." Vivian felt very heavy at heart. She desperately wanted all those beautiful, sublime feelings Stephen had spoken of to come back to her memory. But as she looked at the multicolored pictures, she felt absolutely nothing. Vivic, not even the slightest glimmer of memory. Vivi was terribly embarrassed, so she could only shake her head negatively. "That's what I thought," his husband said in a much colder tone. "Vivi, sometimes I think you don't even try to remember things. I know it's hard for you, but you could just try to trust me and Mom. If your memory still won't come back to you. Look at your right hand." Vivian obediently stared at her right hand, where on the ring finger was a wedding ring with a huge pink diamond. Stephen intercepted her gaze and nodded briefly. "See, that's the ring I gave you the day I proposed. You were so happy to receive it. So happy that you said yes to me right away." "Stephen." Vivi tried to defend herself, but her husband gestured for her to shut up. "Please let me finish," he said, and a mournful expression spread over his face. "You don't remember now, but you and I have always been part of the same whole. We loved each other so much that we even made special vows to each other for our wedding." Stephen rummaged through his wife's bathroom cabinet and pulled out a large envelope. Inside was a sheet of coated paper, neatly folded in half. On the sheet was a typewritten love letter in which Vivian poured out her feelings to her future husband. "Here, read it carefully," she asked her husband. "If it doesn't awaken in you even a little memory of how happy we were, then I beg you to know. I'm begging you, Vivi, just take my word for it. I love you. I love you more than anything in the world, and I always will." With these words, the man left his wife's room, leaving her alone with her wedding vows and her own far from rosy thoughts. Vivian read the message to her husband and cried. crying because she could not remember how she had written it, nor what she had felt while doing so. The vow was truly beautiful, so pure, so sincere. God, why? I don't remember any of this, she asked herself, and God the same question. Why couldn't she love her husband again and remember him? Cindy's mother-in-law's advice didn't help either, even though they cooked together in the expansive kitchen and traveled into town together to walk the places that Vivian loved most, as Cindy assured her Vivian did. It was all to no avail. It was as if there was a huge stone wall inside Vivian that prevented her from looking into the depths of her own memory and remembering everything. At the same time, Vivian was never left alone for a minute. She was always with her mother-in-law or Stephen himself. She and her husband went out into the city a couple of times a week. There they went shopping, to restaurants. Or Stephen tried to spend time with his wife, visiting theaters, movies, and exhibitions. Vivi was very grateful to her husband for his care, but did not understand why she could not do all the same, but on her own, without his presence. The woman wanted some freedom, some personal space. She hoped unsuccessfully that if she could be alone with her thoughts, her memory might come back to her much faster. No, sweetheart, that's not possible, Stephen told her over and over again. You're too weak to control yourself completely. What if you get dizzy? Or, God forbid, you'll lose consciousness and fall back into a coma? Vivi, darling, I wouldn't survive that. But I'll have to go out on my own someday. You can't lock me up in our house forever. At the thought of that, Vivi immediately shuddered. She suddenly realized that she couldn't stand closed spaces and loneliness. Stephen, seeing his wife's reaction to his words, instantly became nervous with excitement. The corner of his eye even twitched. What is it, Vivi? Did you remember something? He asked strangely. No, she answered. Why do you ask? Her husband relaxed visibly at once and spoke more softly. It seemed to me as if you felt something new. Maybe you remembered that you and I had argued like this before. Vivian shook her head negatively. Not really, but you're right. I realized I couldn't be alone for too long. Something inside the woman seemed to push her, and she looked at her husband carefully. Stephen, why haven't any of my friends called me in all this time? Don't I have any friends? The phone you gave me doesn't have anyone in my contact list except you and Cindy. What about my parents? Where are they, Stephen? There were so many questions that Stephen involuntarily started pacing around the room where they were talking. It was one of those evenings when they were about to go to the premiere of the Capitol's play, which was on tour in their city. The man was visibly animated and was tugging his cuffs with excitement, pretending to correct his emerald cufflinks. What is it, my dear? Vivian looked at him incomprehensibly. Is there something you haven't told me yet? I'm not leaving here until I know the whole truth. Stephen glanced nervously at his wife, and in her heart she had an unpleasant feeling that something was being kept from her. It's just that you've chosen the wrong time to have this conversation, Stephen said at last. We have to go to the theater now, and you're talking about your parents, your friends. Let's talk later. Vivi felt a sudden surge of anger and irritation. She kicked her foot forcefully on the fluffy carpet. Vivian felt herself begin to shake. She was clearly becoming hysterical, and her husband thankfully realized it too. Stephen jumped up to Vivi and hugged her tightly, trying to warm her up and calm her trembling. Are you kidding me? He stroked his spouse's back. That's what I was talking about. It's too soon for you to be alone. He sat her down on the bed and said in a soft but sad voice, Your parents? They died a long time ago, Vivi. What? How long ago? The girl could barely ask. Her husband nodded his head affirmatively. It was a camping accident. Your mother and father were mountaineers and often rafted their kayaks on wild river places. One day their boat couldn't handle one of the rapids and flipped over. Vivi looked at her spouse with eyes red with tears. Had they drowned? He nodded sadly and stroked Vivi's cheek. The river was very cold, and the current was very strong in those places. Their deaths were inevitable. I'm sorry, dear, I'm so sorry. Vivian burst into tears and buried her face in her husband's shoulder. God, what a nightmare. Ah, how long ago it happened? A long time ago, darling. You were only 20 at the time. You told me about it yourself. Stephen gently stroked his wife's head and whispered soothing words in her ear. Then he continued carefully. And as for girlfriends, I bought you a new cell phone because your previous one broke during the accident. There are no other contacts in it, as I didn't want you to be disturbed by anyone else during your rehabilitation. Vivian calmed down a bit and, wiping her tears, said, That's right. I didn't even think of that. I'm sorry, Steve. I'm so ashamed that I might have thought badly of you. I really thought you were hiding something from me. My husband only smiled and affectionately suggested, If you want to meet with your friends, I'll give them your new number, but just be sure to stay in touch. During the walk, I need to know you're okay, you know. Vivi nodded. The news made her feel a little better. Well, that's good, said her husband. You know, I've changed my mind about going to the theater tonight. I think we have enough emotions for this evening. Let me put you a sedative that the doctor prescribed, and then we'll go to bed early. Okay, Vivi thought, and agreed. She was really emotionally exhausted. Her husband assured her that he was not offended by his wife's suspicion. He understood everything. After all, to live without the past is such a stress. After giving his wife an injection, Stephen exhaled with relief when she fell into a blissful sleep a few minutes later. That night he realized for the first time that he and Vivian had a long way to go before she finally accepted that her true place was in this house and in his, and only his, heart. That same night, Vivian had a very strange dream that later Vivek could not get out of her mind. In that dream, she could not realize where exactly she was. Everything around her was covered with bright orange flashes, and the woman herself could not breathe properly because of the smoke that entered her lungs. Bitter and acrid, the smoke mourned all the objects the businessman's wife was trying to reach in a futile attempt to save them from the oncoming flames. Vivi could feel the increasing heat in her skin, but she could see no way out of the smoky space. Then, as if out of nowhere, two blurry figures appeared in front of her. Vivian couldn't see exactly what they looked like, but she sensed that one of them, the taller one, was a man, and the other, the smaller one, was clearly a child. Vivian heard a strong male voice ahead of her. Where are you, Vivian? The voice repeated her name over and over again, and she tried to shout out quickly. I am here. But no sound came out of her throat. In desperation, the woman grabbed her own neck and suddenly heard a child's shrill cry. Mommy, mommy, here. And she began to thrash about in the blinding fiery mist, trying to reach or at least get closer to the ghostly figures that were calling her soul. She realized that she absolutely had to give them a sign that she was here, that she was alive and all was well. But the blurred silhouettes grew farther away the closer Vivian tried to get to them. Finally, in a rush of inhuman despair, the woman screamed into the void, watching the figures recede and disappear into the smoke. Wait, please don't leave me here. Don't. I want to come to you. Wake up. Stephen called out to her, and at that moment the woman opened her huge blue eyes. It turned out that she was still lying in her bed, and her husband was sitting beside her, leaning over her and shaking her by the shoulders to make her wake up. Her husband's face was visibly troubled and sad. What's the matter, Vivi? What did you see? The spouse, still not fully awake from what she had seen, only waved her head and removed her husband's hands from her. "It's all right, Steve. It's nothing like that. It was just a nightmare." The young woman struggled to regain her breath and looked affectionately at her husband. "Don't worry, just give me a couple minutes." "Okay." Vivian turned on her other side, trying to control her feelings. What she had seen in her dream was so vivid and realistic that she couldn't shake the thought that it might well have been a memory. Except which one? And why hadn't she seen Stephen in this strange dream, as if he had nothing to do with it? "Was that you screaming?" Stephen said slowly. "Are you sure you don't need sedatives? I could get you some pills if you want." Vivi looked at her husband with frank surprise. "Are you serious, honey? Sedatives at 10 in the morning? Are you trying to turn me into a vegetable?" Stephen tensed for a moment, but Vivi laughed lightly and threw a pillow at him. "I was only joking, silly. Of course I don't mean anything like that. Really, it's just a bad dream. There's no need to take a pill every time I get emotional." Stephen smiled, but somehow not cheerfully, as if he felt guilty about something. However, quickly pretending that nothing of the sort had happened, he offered his favorite wife to drink coffee together. "Mom today even baked us cheesecakes before rushing to work. As long as I live, every time I am amazed at her amazing ability to combine the talents of a housewife and a businesswoman." "Oh my God, I'm so embarrassed," Vivian said with her hands clasped in front of her face. "I was supposed to get up early and prepare everything. Instead, I have to bother your mother in the kitchen." Stephen only waved his hand and then gently kissed his wife on the cheek. "You just don't know her. In fact, she was always happy with all this amateur work with pots and pans. Before she lost her father, she was a housewife for a long time, raising me and taking care of my father when he came home from work. And then when Dad died of a heart attack, she got serious about the business. Daddy left us some inheritance. She used it to open her first beauty parlor." Vivian looked at her husband with genuine interest. It was the first time he had told her so frankly about his family. "I was just a boy then. I had just turned 17. At first I could not accept this new identity of my mother. But then she explained to me clearly that in this life you have to fight for your own to the end, to gnaw with your teeth, but not to give it to anyone. So I entered first the institute at the Faculty of Economics, and then got a job in a bank. But gradually I made my way into the world, found myself." Stephen tenderly embraced Vivian, and she allowed himself to kiss her for real. For a moment, the woman thought that the dream she had had was just a meaningless nightmare. A couple of hours later, when her husband was about to go to work, Vivian's phone suddenly rang insistently. Looking at the screen, the woman was surprised to find that the call was from an unknown number. "Pick up the phone," Stephen advised her, throwing his jacket over his shoulders. "I'm sure you'll be glad to know who's calling." Really, Vivi raised her eyebrows and answered the incoming call. Hello. Is that you?" An unfamiliar female voice sounded in the receiver. "Yes, it's Vivian Smith," Vivi answered, perplexed, and looked at her husband. "Who's speaking?" There was a second pause at the other end of the line, and then the same thin voice said, offended, "No, you don't recognize me, of course. Steve said that you had a memory problem, but to be so." Vivian looked at her husband again, dismissing the questions like, "Who's that?" But the man only winked at her and pointed to his watch. In a hurry, he whispered with just his lips, "I'll hang up." Then her husband went off to work with a satisfied look, leaving Vivian utterly confused. She reminded herself that Cindy was due home in half an hour to check on her and see if everything was all right. So who should she deal with, her mother-in-law or the one who was tearing her phone apart? The caller continued to bombard Vivi with endless questions. "Listen, you seriously don't remember us? It's me, Laurel, your best friend." Steve told us you were off limits while you were in treatment. We apologized profusely during that time. And then yesterday he texts us and tells us to take you out to New York City. No, he's always been Mr. Spontaneous. I'm sorry to be so blunt. Wait, Laurel, stop. Vivi tried to calm her down. Are you saying that you and I used to be friends before the accident? I mean, you're my best friend? I'm sure I am, she said, and then added a moment later, no, well, you've even been friends with Ellen for a long time, but not as close as you are with me. Embarrassed by the appearance of another person in her life, whom she did not remember at all, Vivi proposed Laurel to meet in the city center, in the same cafe where they usually liked to be with her husband. The woman wanted to talk to this girl and try to remember her. After all, Laurel was so insistent that they had known each other for years. However, meeting her friend had only disappointed Vivian, to say the least. Not only did she remember absolutely nothing of the things the girl had told her, but Laurel was also a very unpleasant person in her own right. Vivi couldn't believe that she had trusted this nasty and jealous girl with all her secrets. She would never share anything with such a gossipy girl. While they were sitting in the cafe, she had managed to wash her hands of all their mutual acquaintances. And although half of them Vivian had never even seen, she was offended that Laurel was so unashamedly throwing dirt on everyone. So, you say we worked together in the modeling business? Vivian asked at one point to interrupt her endless rant. Laurel was silent for a second, as if her internal computer was struggling to process this simple question. Finally, an uncertain smile appeared on her face. Yes, and don't you remember our shows in Milan? How you and I discussed that famous model. She looks so beautiful in all the magazines, but in reality she's fat. It still amazes me what those agents saw in her. She's a natural scarecrow. Laurel laughed unpleasantly, revealing her large white teeth. Vivi continued to stir the rest of her milkshake in a tall glass with a straw. Who do I like better, dogs or cats? Vivi asked again. What her friend stared at her with long, thickly painted eyelashes. What's cats got to do with it? Vivian looked at her carefully. But it's such a simple question. You say you've known me since high school. Then you can't help but know what kind of animals I like more. All best friends answer questions like that with ease, especially when some of them have memory problems. What Vivian certainly didn't expect was that Laurel would suddenly pull out her cell phone out of the blue and start hysterically texting something in it to someone. What are you doing? Vivi asked her with a smile. She wouldn't be surprised if Laurel was posting some nasty things about her on the internet right now. But she didn't care about that at all. She just wanted to understand what was going on here. Laurel finished fiddling with her smartphone and with a strained grin, obviously meant to portray a smile, she said. Vivian, I've been called away on an emergency shoot. I'd love to talk to you more, but unlike you, I don't have a rich husband, so I have to work up a sweat. Laurel jumped up from the table and gave Vivian a kiss. Don't be upset, Vivi, we'll talk to you later, and then you'll feel better. Ciao, darling, I'll be in touch. With those words, the red-haired gossip girl flew away from the cafe like a bright but silly butterfly. There seemed to be something wrong with Laurel. Vivian Vivek couldn't believe she would choose such a mercenary as her mate. Besides, she didn't know the answer to her simple question. And the whole thing with the phone? She was just looking for an excuse to leave quickly and not continue the awkward conversation. But what could it mean? Vivian was at a loss to guess. She had too many questions about her own past, and none of them had been answered yet. Hearing the phone vibrate in her purse, the woman picked it up immediately. Hello, honey, how are you? Stephen asked, calling her from work. To be honest, not so good, her wife admitted to him. I didn't like it at all. What kind of friend is she who only has clothes and gossip on her mind? Really? I could hear the tension in her husband's voice. "You don't have to talk to her if you want to. I just thought it would be good for you to spend some time with old acquaintances. You said so yourself." Yes, I remember," Vivi reassured him. "It just wasn't as heartwarming as I'd imagined. I'm going home now, Mary's already there. I could cook us all something original for dinner tonight." They chatted a little more about household matters, after which Vivian hung up the phone and headed home on foot. She wanted to walk a little, to be alone with her thoughts, and just to rest in silence after Laurel's rapid chatter. The weather that day was marvelous. Spring was in full swing. Apple trees were blooming everywhere. The flower beds were bursting with blossoming flowers. The air was fragrant with the scents of flowers and herbs. And Vivian lingered for a couple of minutes in one of the yards near the playground, looking at the happy little children playing in the sandbox. At the sight of this idyllic scene, she was suddenly overwhelmed by an incredible longing. "I wish Stephen and I had a baby of our own. That's how I could sit and watch our son or daughter now. Maybe then I'd feel a lot more at peace." The young woman sat down on the bench, watching other people's children with pleasure. Some of them were happily swinging on the swings, while their mothers looked proudly in Vivian's direction. "Look, envy, what happiness we have growing up." Suddenly Vivian felt her hands and feet go cold. Something switched in the young woman's mind, and she clearly, as if in reality, saw herself rocking a small child in her arms. The newborn was sleeping peacefully. His eyes were closed. At that moment, Vivian was absolutely sure that she was holding her own son in her arms. However, her vision did not end there. The woman felt strong and gentle arms around her shoulders. Vivian turned around to look at the child's father, and to her great amazement, she saw in front of her not Stephen at all. A tall, broad-shouldered, handsome man with deep dark green eyes and golden curly hair. Vivian did not fit the image of her husband. Stephen was a stocky brunette, slender but a little taller than herself. This stranger, on the other hand, looked as if he had stepped out of the pages of ancient legends. Vivian did not know this beautiful man, nor the child she held in her arms, but she was sure that they both had something to do with her. Could it be that Stephen was hiding something from her after all? Was it possible that Vivian had another family before him? But then where are they? What happened to them? Intrigued, Vivian immediately hurried home. She eagerly awaited her husband's return so she could talk to him about her vision. Cindy, seeing how worried her daughter-in-law was, became nervous herself. Seating Vivian in the kitchen, she tried to quickly question her about what had happened and how the meeting with her friend had gone. But Vivian was not in the mood for a heart-to-heart talk with her mother-in-law. "Is there anything I can do for you, dear?" Cindy asked, looking into Vivian's eyes. "I'm afraid Stephen is the only one who can help me here," she sighed. "I need to have a very serious talk with him." A shadow passed over the older woman's face, the nature of which Vivian could not determine. The young woman said she needed to rest, and then went upstairs to her room. That same evening, when Stephen returned home, Vivian immediately called him to her room and told him frankly of her sudden recollection. After listening to his wife, the businessman was a little confused at first, but quickly pulled himself together. Vivian was amazed at how quickly the emotions on his face changed. In a few moments she could distinguish surprise, anger, confusion, and then a calmness that hid all the other feelings. "Vivian, darling, listen to me very carefully," he began, setting his wife down on the bed. "What you are saying is impossible." "But why?" She looked at him perplexed. "Stephen, I feel that these people are somehow connected to me, and very strongly. That emotion, that image, it was so real, so familiar. If there's anything I don't know about myself, you have to tell me." Stephen covered his face with his hands, as if trying to shut out his own feelings. "The doctors warned me that this kind of thing could happen," he said slowly. "You've been in a coma too long. and part of your brain is still not fully recovered. What do you mean, Stephen? Vivian interrogated him. What's wrong with me? Her husband looked at her sorrowfully. Visions, hallucinations. The doctor said it could be the effects of a coma. I'm sorry, Vivian, I should have told you sooner. Vivian didn't immediately realize what her husband was telling her. When she did, she shook her head negatively. No, Stephen, no. That's the thing. It wasn't a figment of my imagination. I'm sure I saw a part of my past, but I can't figure out when it was, or who these people are to me. Stephen looked at his wife with unspeakable regret. Honey, that's the way it is sometimes. You may have experienced a powerful emotional jolt when you looked at the children. So your mind tried to deceive you, to make you wishful thinking. No, Vivian persisted. I'm normal, Stephen. I know for a fact that I've seen these people before. Stephen, I didn't tell you about my dream, that nightmare. I guessed it right away, he nodded. Yes, confirmed Vivian. I think I saw the same man and boy. Only it was later than the memories on the playground. Stephen's face immediately darkened. Vivian, let's not try to find an explanation for your delusions. I'm certainly not very pleased that you see some strange man in your visions. But as for the child... Vivian jumped out of bed and nervously splayed her hands. Yes, Stephen, I wanted to ask another question. Why we still don't have children? You just said that the memory could have been triggered by children playing. What did you mean by that? Instead of answering, her spouse slowly got out of bed, then calmly walked over to the small medicine cabinet and pulled out a syringe of sedative from there. Noticing this, Vivian stepped back. No, Stephen, I don't want a sedative. Explain to me what those kids and my visions have to do with each other. Stephen, what are you doing? The young woman's eyes filled with pure terror as her husband began to step toward her, holding the finished shot in his hand. His face was completely impenetrable. Honey, it's okay, don't worry, you just need to calm down a bit. Look at you, you're shaking all over. Vivian retreated further and further until she finally felt something solid under her back. It was a wall. The young woman's heart filled with panic. She turned around in an attempt to find a way out. But at that moment, her husband grabbed her arms sharply, depriving her of the opportunity to resist. Stephen, please don't, Vivian begged. I don't want to. I'm scared. Stephen forcefully pulled his wife against him, and in one deft movement stuck a syringe with a sedative into her neck. Don't be afraid, honey, don't be afraid. It's okay, he whispered. I'll never let you go. Never. We'll always be together. Vivian's eyes immediately went blurry. The room was covered in mist in an instant. When Stephen loosened his embrace and laid her gently on the bed, the woman looked at him with a blank stare. Her body went limp, and she could no longer control it. Vin. She barely audibly stretched out in a weakening voice. There was a mute question in her eyes. Why? Honey, we don't have children because you're infertile, her husband suddenly said affectionately. I did not want to talk about it, so as not to traumatize your already fragile psyche. But now I see that we can't do without it, Vivek. I'll have to call a psychotherapist for you tomorrow. He'll prescribe you a new course of medication and you'll definitely get better. No, everything inside Vivi screamed, but she couldn't say a word out loud. She didn't know what kind of drug her husband had injected her with, but she was sure that it was definitely not a sedative, more like tranquilizers. That's what we used to use to tame the horses on our farm, the woman's mind flashed somewhere on the farthest edge of her consciousness, between dream and reality. Vivian didn't have time to take hold of the thought, because everything around her was plunged into darkness. She didn't wake up until the next morning. Stephen wasn't around, so Vivi carefully slipped into the shower to wash away the remnants of sleep, and the semi-fainting state caused by the strange medication. Vivian, shivering, thought, God, am I really not dreaming all this? She stood under the powerful jets of hot water. Did I really remember something Stephen didn't like, and that's why he did this to me? The woman twitched in disgust. She remembered the creepy expression that had flashed across Stephen's face the moment he'd given her the injection. God, he looked like a lunatic. I can't stay in this house around him anymore. I need answers. Slipping out of the bathroom, Vivian got dressed and cautiously made her way down to the first floor. She heard Stephen and his mother talking quietly to each other in the kitchen. To Vivi's surprise, the conversation between the relatives was in English. As she listened to them, she was amazed to realize that she understood them perfectly. But when the words made complete sense to her, Vivi was forced to slowly slide down the wall, sitting on the floor. Her legs refused to hold her up, instantly becoming absorbent cotton from the shock. Did I tell you were playing with fire, Cindy? Cindy rebuked her son. You shouldn't make fun of the girl. One day she'll remember her past, and the next day, God forbid, she'll put 2 and 2 together about Greg. What are we going to do if the truth comes out? Keep your voice down. Stephen shouted at her in English. I don't know why it happened. The doctors said that the effect of the drugs was 100%. She shouldn't remember anything from her past at all. Nothing that happened to her before me. Cindy shook her head doomedly. Do you realize what you've done, son? You've ruined her whole life. And you keep doing the same thing now. She'll never love you. She can't. She's too attached to the past. No, Mom. The businessman shouted loudly. Vivian is mine and mine alone, do you understand? I won't let her leave us, and I won't let you tear us apart. Come to your senses, Stephen. Cindy pleaded with him. If you don't stop now, it's only going to get worse, Cindy continued. Do you really want a wife who has the memory of a fish? I mean, she's really going to go crazy like that. Is that what you want? For a moment, there was a long pause between mother and son. Then Vivi heard Stephen dialing someone's number on his phone. He never turned off the keypad's sound, so the numbers sounded subtle every time he touched them. What are you doing? Cindy asked him coldly in Russian. I'm calling Vivi's doctor, he answered calmly. Don't you dare, his mother whispered threateningly. I'm not going to be a part of this charade anymore. I've put up with it all this time just for your sake. Don't worry, Mom, I'll take care of it, Stephen said confidently, and then started talking to someone Vivi couldn't hear. However, that was enough for the woman. Putting her hand over her mouth to keep from screaming in fear, she struggled to her feet and quickly ran back into her room. There, Vivi hastily threw some change of clothes and personal items into her backpack. She needed to wait until Stephen went to the airport. He had told his wife a couple of days ago that he was going on a very important business trip to London. This business trip was the only chance for Vivi to save her own life. The woman heard her husband's footsteps on the stairs and quickly shoved her backpack under the bed, lay back down and pulled the blanket up to her chin, pretending she wanted to lie down a little longer. There you are, my Sonia, Stephen said with a smile, entering the room. The time is almost 10. It's time to get up. The man stroked his wife's head affectionately, and she hardly smiled back. It's just that the day ended so abruptly yesterday. Vivi pretended that she didn't remember much about the previous evening. She stretched sweetly and put her hands on her husband's shoulders. He shouldn't have suspected anything. So Vivi played her part well, even if it was through effort. I'm leaving tonight, remember? Stephen asked her. Vivian nodded in agreement. Mom will look after you until the doctor comes, her husband continued. Cold, prickly goosebumps ran up and down Vivian's back. Be good and do whatever the doctor tells you to do, Stephen said. Okay? And I'll try to get back as soon as possible. 10 days, I think, at the most. Vivi's heart thundered in her chest. 10 days, she'd have almost 2 weeks to accomplish what she'd planned. Thank you, God. That long? Vivi asked aloud, desperately playing the model wife. But I'll miss you. Instead of answering, Stephen kissed his young wife. That's good, he said with a satisfied smile. I like you much better like this, and forget everything we talked about yesterday. I love you with or without children. Vivi nodded and smiled radiantly at him. As soon as the businessman left the house, the woman immediately jumped out of bed and continued packing. After taking some cash from her jewelry box and taking all the jewelry, Vivian felt she was ready. Whatever her husband was up to, if he was her husband at all, she wasn't going to stay in this house another minute. Vivian would find the answers to all her questions on her own, and finally find out who she was and how she had ended up in this golden prison. When the moment was right, Vivi slipped out through the emergency exit to the garage and from there slipped through the gate to the outside. As soon as the young woman crossed the threshold of the estate, everything in her soul literally sang, freedom. Vivian thought to herself, there is nothing better and more precious than this. After taking the bus to the city, Vivi immediately went to one unremarkable but decent hostel, which she had time to look up information about beforehand. She needed to hide in a place where Stephen wouldn't be able to find her right away. That's why any variant with a hotel or a fancy hotel was out of the question for her. First of all, Vivian didn't have that much money to pay for a room in them. Secondly, she wanted to minimize the use of her husband Stephen's bank cards. Vivian was well aware that as soon as he discovered her absence, it would be the cards that he would check first. Once she was settled in her micro room, Vivian opened her laptop and began searching for information about herself, and then for all the psychologists in the city who used hypnosis in their work. As she thought, there wasn't much information about the Smith family on the internet, and most of it was about Stephen and his mother. True, she did find a few notes about their wedding. However, there were no details or photos from the celebration in those short notes. This is all strange, Vivian thought to herself as she looked through a sliver of a fashionable society magazine. Usually when a celebrity gets married, the journalists are there. But this was clearly not our case. Finished with her mini investigation, the young woman turned her attention to finding hypnotherapists. Soon she was lucky enough to find a private clinic where a psychology professor practicing aggressive hypnosis worked. After changing her clothes and pretending to be a really rich and wealthy lady, Vivian went to the address given on the website. The psychologist turned out to be a pleasant elderly man in his 60s. After looking at Vivian carefully, he asked, I even set fire to that house of yours, along with your not-so-husband and your whole complex. I hoped if there wasn't even a reminder of who you once were, you'd finally think about it and choose me and our beautiful life together. Vivian was shaking all over, but she held on with all her might. You scoundrel, she shouted at him. I'll report you. You'll go to jail. Stephen only smiled unpleasantly. No one will prove anything, my sweet. How did you find me? Vivi asked in desperation. Have you been following me? Smith smirked. I figured out where you were thanks to a tiny tracking device I put in your phone. As soon as I got here, I immediately rushed over to where you wanted to sit out those few days. When I heard you'd gone to counseling, I knew anything could happen. So I came straight after you. The man made another circle around Vivi. If you want to know where your kid is, I'll tell you he's in an orphanage. Only I don't know which one. I had my men drop your boy off with them. They didn't even tell me where, so you wouldn't be able to find him if anything went wrong. Vivi rose slowly to her feet, looking at him with all the hatred she could muster. You're a monster, Vivi spat in his face. We'll never be together. Not even if you're the last man on earth. Even if you erase my memory. I won't remember my own name. We'll never be together. Do you hear me? Never. Because I hate you and I'll always feel that hatred in my heart. like I felt you were nothing to me. Like I felt I had Greg, the man I will love with all my heart forever, even after he's dead. The exhausted Vivi, bent in half, expected that the businessman would probably just want to kill her now. But to her great amazement, Stephen's face was contorted with a grimace of genuine heartache. But it lasted only a moment, and then contempt flashed in his eyes again. Fool. What a fool you are, Vivian. I gave you everything. I've given you everything, and you ungrateful hysteric, have gone into things you shouldn't have known. Stephen kicked the woman in the stomach with his foot, and Vivian instantly gasped in pain. Flashes flickered in her eyes. You're a plant, Smith said, pulling out the barrel. And you asked for it. If you had only listened to me, I would have spared your stupid heart. Things might be very different now. Vivian, realizing that the inevitable finale was coming for her, closed her eyes tightly and whispered softly. Greg, my darling, I'm coming to you, my darling. And at the same second, Vivi felt a shadow fly past her. There was a rumble, but the woman felt nothing, only shrank with horror. When she opened her eyes, she saw someone big and strong hitting Stephen one after another, knocking the gun out of his hands. You bastard, you got it. She heard a quiet voice that sounded painfully familiar. Greg, Vivian said, not believing her ears. Is it really you? Are you alive? Greg knocked out the rogue businessman, then slowly turned around and rushed to his wife. In an armful of tenderly squeezed in an embrace exhausted sobs Vivi. It's all right, sweetheart. It's definitely going to be okay now. I'm alive. He's alive. She nodded toward Stephen. You didn't kill him? Greg only grinned slyly. Don't worry, the bastard will live. He's only in the cell now. I videotaped him abusing you and what he said about our farm. I think that'll be good enough for the police. Vivian gently pulled away from her husband. Greg, tell me what happened then. How did you manage to get out of the house? And Eden, did you hear what he said about our son? The giant man stroked his lover's cheek and smiled gently at her. Calm down, Vivi. At home we live in another city now. I couldn't stay here knowing you were dead, but that's what I thought at the time. Greg told Vivian that he managed to get out of the burning house in time when he found that everything around was on fire. They stunned me, the Bigfoot hombres. I saw them trying to get into the house, so I wanted to fight them back. But they were strong, the bastards. I woke up in the back room. I guess they were hoping I'd burn to death in there. What they didn't know is that we have a small exit there. I'd accidentally blocked it with gardening tools and I couldn't see it from the inside. Greg looked around to see if Stephen was all right, that is, if he had regained consciousness. Luckily, he was still unconscious. That's how I got out. I broke the glass first and then I tore up the boards to make it easier, Greg explained to his wife. His look became incredibly sad. He hugged Vivi again. She hugged him back. I buried you, Vivian, he said slowly. When the fire was put out, all I found was your bracelet and ring. I thought you were lost in the flames. Vivi looked at Greg with an inexpressible love and devotion in her eyes. No, they put me to sleep and took me away. Did you hear that? Yes, and he'll have to answer for it in court. You'll see, the man assured her, his eyes burning with righteous anger. I found my son almost immediately. I couldn't believe that they were ready to send the child to the grave innocently. Thank God, Greg said, wiping his forehead with the back of his hand. Vivi saw the first gray in his temples. She reached up and stroked his hair. You found our son, you saved the baby. These thugs are not as smart as their master expected them to be, her husband explained to her. They gave our son to the first nearest orphanage. I didn't even have to go to the neighboring region. I took him right away. He, of course, was frightened a lot, but nothing. The guy is strong. Our dad was waiting for you to come for me, he said. He believed you'd save me from bad people. Vivian did not restrain her emotions any longer and kissed her lawful wedded husband firmly. Take me to our house, please, his wife asked him. I really want to see my son, and I really want to be with you in our new home. Greg smiled, and wrinkles gathered in small clumps in the corners of his eyes. Of course, my favorite. We'll call the police first. We can't leave this gentleman here like this. When the police arrived, Greg explained everything thoroughly and showed them the tape. The investigator was shocked to learn that such a powerful man as Smith could go to such a heinous crime because of a trivial obsession with a woman, even one as beautiful as Vivian was. Now, Vivi's false husband faces a long prison sentence. His mother, Stacy, upon learning of what had happened, immediately left for another city. She no longer wanted to help her son in his crimes. You've made your own mess. Now you have to clean it up, she said to Stephen. Greg and Vivian returned to their new home in a neighboring town. Greg, who has lost almost everything, is not discouraged. He hopes that in time he can build a new farm for their family and start over. He still has connections with some of his former employees, so he has no doubts about success. Eden, upon learning that his mom was alive, took it as the truest of miracles, a toddler who is almost 5. Now every day puts a candle at home for the health of his mom, because he loves her very much and missed her very much all this time, while Vivian was actually in captivity at the businessman Smith. The Smith family is together again, and now truly happy. After all, they were able to pass such tests which not every person on the birth falls. Vivian sincerely believes that only devotion and faith in her heart helped her to eventually remember her beloved husband and son and rediscover herself. When Maggie went to the bank to collect her inheritance, she expected nothing. And when the orphan opened the safe deposit box, on another cold January morning, Maggie lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. For 6 months now, every day had begun the same way. She lay there and thought with horror that a dull, meaningless day lay ahead of her. Maggie was not yet 30 years old. She wasn't bad looking, but finding a husband and building a family had never worked out for her. Her rare liaisons with men didn't last more than 6 months. She didn't understand why she had no luck on the personal front. Either men were not suitable, or her character was not quite good. But Maggie wasn't too worried about that. She didn't want to start any serious relationships. For several years, she had been immersed in caring for her elderly grandmother, the kindest woman who had raised Maggie since she was 3 years old, ever since her parents had been killed in an accident. She and Grandma had bailed each other out back then. The grandmother had kept the girl out of the orphanage by taking over her upbringing, and Maggie gave her grandmother new meanings in life, the meaning of which was to raise her beloved granddaughter. Most likely, this is what helped the woman cope with the loss of her only son and daughter-in-law. 3 years ago, the grandmother fell ill. She could move around the apartment by herself, but still she needed constant care. And of course, her granddaughter began to take care of her, driving her to doctors, shopping, doing all the housework. At the time, Maggie was 26 years old. She had just found a good job with a decent salary and was preparing to go for a promotion. Maggie even considered moving out of her grandmother's apartment into her own first rented, and then planned to take out a mortgage. But the illness of the old woman crossed all these plans. Without thinking, Maggie forgot about career heights, stayed in her old position, and all her free time devoted to her grandmother. They were unpretentious in life, so Maggie's salary and grandmother's payments were enough to pay for doctors and medicines. Maggie had little memory of her parents. They were often on the road before their deaths, so they left their young daughter to her grandmother. Because of this, Maggie had only a few memories of her parents, and she thought some of them were just dreams. And she and her grandmother hit it off from the start. The older woman had managed to replace Maggie's father and mother. In all the years they had lived together, they had never had a single major conflict. Even when Maggie was going through a transitional age, it was probably because her grandmother worked as a school teacher and had a good understanding of how to get along with children. For Maggie, her grandmother was a self-evident part of her life, and she didn't think about her death. Not even when the woman had had an unfortunate accident 3 years ago. Maggie pushed away thoughts of her grandmother soon to be gone. She just gave all the help she could, tried to organize good treatment, and hoped for the best. Grandma didn't get any worse before she died. She wasn't taken to the hospital. She spent the day as usual. She read, watched TV, called her neighbor, and inquired about her granddaughter's life. Toward nightfall, she said goodnight to Maggie and she went to her room. The next day, Grandma didn't wake up. The days of the funeral had merged into one terrible dream for Maggie. She didn't even remember how she had organized everything. How did the funeral and the wake go? She wanted to get over it and forget it all. But after all the funeral procedures came an even worse state for Maggie's silence. It was not only psychologically but physically hard for her to return after work to an apartment where no one was waiting for her. An apartment where the TV didn't work, where there was no aroma of something delicious, where there was no warmth and coziness. She hated waking up in the morning for exactly the same reason. No one else wished her a good morning and good luck before work. She didn't understand why she had to get up every morning and come home every evening. 6 months of despondency, only occasionally replaced by happy evenings spent with her friend in cafes or at each other's houses. This morning didn't bode well for the day to be any different from the previous ones. Maggie reluctantly got up, drank her coffee and sandwich, and got ready for work, despite her good paycheck. Maggie dressed, to put it mildly, without glamour, wore the same things for several years, and her winter down jacket, from which every now and then the fluff was trying to pop out, had recently celebrated its 5-year anniversary. So from the outside, she gave the impression of a poor girl. A typical gray mouse. Almost running, she reached the streetcar stop and went to work. And at 8:55, the office was already noisy. The bosses were strict about tardiness. Maggie walked into her office, which her friend Samantha and 2 other female co-workers shared with her. "What are you like? You're not alive, are you?" Maggie's friend asked thoughtfully as she sat down in her seat. "I don't know, I can't do the same thing every day." "It's boring." Maggie showed a thick stack of papers on her desk. "What's all this for?" "You didn't say that when you walked into this office," Samantha reminded Maggie of her first days on the job 4 years ago. Indeed, Maggie was an exemplary worker with bright eyes and a well-functioning brain. She genuinely loved her job. She didn't just go to it for the money. Colleagues were even afraid to approach her at first, thinking that such efficiency hides a cunning, bossy girl, ready to go over the heads of other employees for the sake of her career. But Samantha managed at some point to break through this workaholic shell and see her as a very ordinary, modest and kind girl. Most likely they managed to get close on the contrast. Unlike Maggie, Samantha was an extremely sociable, cheerful girl, although she was not characterized by great efficiency. Sometimes even Maggie had to cover Samantha's shortcomings in front of her superiors, but such help from her colleague was not worth much trouble. Things had changed in the last 6 months. Maggie would come to the office, permeate the office, perform her work tasks, and leave. Each time, her friend tried to cheer Maggie up in some way. This time, she made the same attempt. "Meg, why don't we go check it out? I heard they opened a new bar near here today. The girls say it's a great place." Well, why not? It had been over a month since the last time she'd been out with her friend, and Maggie decided to give herself a break. But a couple minutes later, she realized, "Oh no, I can't tonight." "Why not? Come on, we got to get back to normal. You want to go shopping before the bar? 'Cause you've turned into such an asshole." No, I'd really like to go, but I already made an appointment to go to the bank today. Is there something wrong with your card, or did your paycheck not come in yesterday? There's nothing wrong with my paycheck, it's just, yesterday was exactly 6 months since Grandma left. I've got an inheritance to settle. I thought I wouldn't have to do anything else but file the deed to the apartment. But the notary called and said there's a safe deposit box in the bank. I'm going to go check it out today. So let's reschedule the bar for tomorrow, for example. Okay, if that's the case, sure. Maybe I'll go with you just in case. You're going out of the bank alone tonight, you know it's dangerous. Don't worry about it, I'll go by myself. There won't be any diamonds. My grandmother was a school teacher, not a rich woman. I wouldn't be surprised if there's been some kind of mistake and the bank just turns me back home. Like the safety deposit box got mixed up. It wasn't really Grandma's. The friends finished talking and got to work. The day was routine. The boss came in only once, politely asked her friend to correct mistakes in the report and left. And Maggie periodically returned her thoughts to this mysterious safe deposit box, about which she had told. The girl did not think much about the inheritance and perceived the upcoming trip to the bank as a normal bureaucratic procedure. But now it no longer seemed to her as something ordinary. If it was not a mistake, what could lie there? Perhaps some family jewelry. But then why in such a strange place? A safety deposit box. Jewelry is usually kept at home to be admired or worn if desired. That's what they're for. This was a safe deposit box. Maggie couldn't even remember the last time her grandmother had been to the bank. Probably before she got sick. Anyway, the closer it got to the end of the day, the more interested Maggie became. Finally, the clock showed 6 p.m., and all the employees, as if on cue, began to pack up to leave. Maggie was not usually one of them. She could stay in her office alone until 7, 8, and sometimes even 21. Since the interest in work was lost, she gave up this habit and began to return with everyone else. Perhaps in the crowd of co-workers walking to their bus stops, Maggie felt less lonely. This time, too, she jumped up with everyone else, but not out of any desire to overcome loneliness. She had to take the streetcar to the bank, but in the other direction. Maggie said goodbye to Samantha and a few other co-workers and ran to the stop. The streetcar came almost immediately. Maggie got on and didn't even have to take an empty seat, sitting near the door. There were only 2 stops to go, but for Maggie the time dragged so slowly that it seemed to her as if the streetcar was going across town. She kept glancing at her watch, worried about not getting there before the bank closed. It closed at 7 p.m., which was why Maggie was so worried. When she got to the right stop, Maggie jumped off the streetcar and ran to the bank. Fortunately, it was still half an hour before closing time. The girl took a little breath and entered the premises, taking a number in the electronic queue. Maggie didn't have to wait long. There wasn't particularly anyone else in the bank at this time. Maggie walked over to the right window and sat down near it. The banker, a full-bodied man in his 40s, was obviously going home early and was already putting things in his briefcase. "Hello," Maggie said at first and took out her papers. "Hello," the banker said, giving Maggie a wry look. "I need access to a safety deposit box." The man leaned slightly out of the window and looked at Maggie again, more carefully. "Why do you need a safety deposit box?" "I want to see what it looks like," Maggie replied irritably, glancing at the banker's name tag, which read in gold letters, "Stephen Swan, Senior Officer." "Stephen, don't you know what people need a safety deposit box for?" "Don't be rude, girl," replied the banker sternly. "Give me the number of the box. Give me your passport." The banker looked through the passport, wrote down some data, entered the number of the safe deposit box into the computer. "This box is not in your name," the man said in the same stern tone. "That's right, it's not in my name. The box belonged to my grandmother. She passed away 6 months ago and I inherited it. Here's the certificate of inheritance." Maggie handed the paper to the banker. "It says there was a safe deposit box in the property." The banker fidgeted with the certificate, looked at the passport again, and went somewhere else. 2 minutes later, he came back and said unhappily, "All right, follow me." Maggie went with him into another room. The banker opened a heavy metal door, behind which there were hundreds of cells of different sizes. The man looked around and went to one of the boxes. He slipped a small key into the keyhole and opened the lock. Sighing heavily, he reluctantly looked into the cell and stunned. After standing for a couple of seconds, in a quiet voice he was able to utter, "Approach, please. The cell is open." Maggie walked leisurely to the box, as if she wanted a little suspense, and there was plenty of suspense to go around. In the box was a bar of gold. "Can I take it?" Maggie asked in a whisper. "Of course it's your property now," the banker replied kindly. He frowned unhappily and then disappeared. Maggie took the ingot in her hands. The bullion looked exactly like it did in the movies. It glistened, shimmering under the light of the bank lamp. It was stamped with the inscription 999.91,000 grams. The first number means the grade, the banker explained to Maggie, and the second is the weight. On the back there was another stamp with a number and other necessary information to prove authenticity. Maggie didn't really listen to what the banker was telling her. She couldn't believe that she was holding a kilogram of pure gold. Even to the touch, it was different from other metal objects of the same size. It seemed to her that the ingot was soft. It felt warm. "What am I supposed to do with it?" Maggie asked rhetorically. The banker shrugged in response. His eyes showed that he was upset that the bullion was not his. An odd reaction for a banker who operated with large sums of money and jewelry on a daily basis. Perhaps he had only served wealthy clients before, and the appearance of large sums of money was no surprise to them. And here a poor girl got a fortune just like that, instantaneously. Some people dream of such things all their lives, and perhaps the banker was one of those people. After standing for a few seconds, he warned Maggie that he had to go and get a form for receiving the contents of the safe deposit box. Maggie didn't bother with the bureaucratic wording and continued to look at the gold. The banker put another bank employee in his place, apparently to keep Maggie from robbing the bank. Maggie shifted her gaze from the bullion to her open safe deposit box. There was some cardboard at the bottom of the box, which was the same color as the box itself, so the bankers didn't pay attention to it. "Excuse me, please," Maggie said to the stone-faced employee. "There's something else in the box. Can I take that too?" "If the box is yours, you can," the emotionless employee replied. Maggie carefully pulled out the cardboard. It turned out to be a heavy paper envelope. There was no addressee, no sender's name, and no stamps on the envelope. Maggie simply put the unopened envelope in her bag. She realized there was some message from her grandmother inside, and she didn't want to read it in front of strangers. "Before you leave, you'll need to sign some papers," the banker suddenly returned. "Sure. Where do I have to go?" "It's protocol to sign right here. But do you really want to take this with you?" The man nodded his head at the ingot. "Yes, why do you ask?" Maggie wondered. "Wouldn't it be safer to leave it in the safe deposit box? Or do you want to sell the bullion right now?" "No, I have all my accounts in another bank, and I think that's where the bullion should be deposited in the near future. I like things to be in their proper place." For a few minutes, Maggie thought that it was really safer to leave such wealth in the bank. But it was not only the desire to move the bullion to another bank that possessed her. The little gold brick had a magical attraction, and Maggie did not want to give it back right away. She wanted to look at it, put it somewhere at home, maybe even show it to a friend. As you wish. It's your right, the banker said quickly. Follow me. Having completed all the bureaucratic procedures with the registration of the bullion, Maggie went home. She didn't want to take public transportation with the gold, so she called a cab. During the ride, she had a twofold feeling. On the one hand, she was overwhelmed by the euphoria of knowing that she was carrying a kilogram of gold worth about $1 million in her bag. On the other hand, she was periodically overcome with panic anxiety. She kept glancing askew at the cab driver, drawing in her mind stories in which he would take her out into the woods and take away her bag. Then Maggie scrutinized the window to see if the cab driver was taking her the right way. Say, why are we going this way? She asked when the car turned off the avenue that ran along the streetcar tracks. There are repair works ahead, replied the driver. They're on their way, the cab driver replied calmly. We'll be stuck in traffic for half an hour. But this way we go faster in the yards. Maggie's heart began to beat strongly. It became difficult for her to breathe. After a couple minutes, she managed to pull herself together. She took out her cell phone and dialed 112 on it beforehand. Maggie watched the road even more carefully. It was getting dark outside and it was hard to see anything. Then she moved to the middle of the back seat of the car and looked out the driver's window. By the light of the headlights, she recognized a small street that ran along the main avenue. It was a little over a kilometer to the house. Maggie calmed down a little and moved to the passenger door again. Don't worry, we'll be there in a few minutes, the cab driver said carefully, watching Maggie's tossing about in the back seat. Yes, all right, Maggie answered him calmly, her voice trembling slightly. Less than a minute later, the car turned again. Are you off the right road? The navigator said loudly. And Maggie realized she couldn't stay in the car any longer. Stop here, please, she shouted. What do you mean here? We're just a little bit away, the cab driver replied calmly. I know, but I need to get out here urgently. Okay, whatever you say, the cabbie sighed heavily and stopped the car. Maggie quickly shoved the fare money into the cab driver's hands and got out of the car. Almost at a run, she headed toward her house. It wasn't much farther, but the second strange turn seemed too suspicious to Maggie. She ran down the very street that ran along the avenue, and soon she saw that there was a road service on it. And right in the middle of it was a fenced-in hole dug. The workers were changing a pipe that ran across both the avenue and this street, and so there was nothing suspicious in the cab driver's sudden turns. He was, however, looking for the easiest way to get to the right house. Maggie breathed a sigh of relief and walked toward her house with a quiet step. She even felt a little ashamed of her overcautiousness. How could the cab driver have known that she had something expensive in her bag? Yes, sudden riches rarely lead to good things. It wasn't long before Maggie saw her 5-story building on the horizon. Just as she turned into the yard, someone tugged her purse sharply, but Maggie held it firmly in her hands. She turned around and saw a man with a scarf hat wrapped around his face. He was pulling the bag toward him. But Maggie had no intention of letting her go. She started screaming loudly. At that moment, 2 men approached them, and the man in the scarf, apparently frightened, let go of the purse and started to run. No one caught up with him. The men approached Maggie. Are you all right? One of them asked fearfully. Yes, I'm fine. Thank you, Maggie said, out of breath. I'm calling the police, the other man said, pulling out his cell phone. Thank you. Maggie turned to both of them. I don't think he would have gotten away if it wasn't for you. Why are you walking alone at this hour? I'm used to it. I've been walking alone all my life. And about this time, Maggie answered. She talked to her casual acquaintances for a while longer, and the police arrived at the scene. The officers quickly took statements from Maggie and witnesses, took pictures of the purse, and went to the next call. Maggie thanked the men again and went home. She didn't like that the police officers left so quickly. It even seemed to Maggie that they weren't even going to look for anyone. They just machine-filled all the paperwork and drove away. She realized that the cops had a heavy workload, but they could have at least taken her to the station so that the experts could fingerprint the bag, make a sketch, and do everything else they usually did in detective shows. Almost immediately, however, Maggie remembered that the man was wearing gloves, and fingerprinting her bag probably didn't make sense. She went up to the second floor, entered the apartment, and felt fear again, a real animal fear for her life. What if the perpetrator decided to come back? After all, if he attacked Maggie right outside her house, that meant he knew her home address. Maggie pulled out her cell phone and selected one of Samantha's contacts. "Come see me soon, please," she said. "I'll explain everything later, but it's really hard for me to be alone right now. Thank you. I'll be waiting." Maggie was afraid that her friend still went to the bar after work and would not see her call. But from the sounds of it, Samantha was already home. In fact, Maggie had no one else to call for help. Her childhood friends had moved away to different cities, and Samantha was the only person she had left who was truly close to her. When her friend agreed to come over, Maggie felt much calmer. She made tea and sat down on the couch. She placed her purse next to her, taking a few sips. Maggie took the purse in her hands, carefully undid the zipper, and opened it. The gold bar was in place. Before she did so, she had thought that the gold might not be in the purse, because after the attack she hadn't even checked to see if the man had taken anything, but everything was fine. Maggie didn't bother to pull out the bullion, zipped up the bag and set it back on the couch. What could it have been, she thought? An accident? No, I don't believe in such coincidences. Right outside my house, a bandit purposely tried to snatch my purse. There's no such thing as coincidence. Then who set him on me? The only person who knew she had the gold bar was the banker, Stephen. How much animosity had he treated her with? And when he saw the bar, a completely different face. That's when he plotted to take it from me, Maggie decided. He's seen my passport, he knows where I live. He's a rascal. He's been away several times, probably calling his accomplices. Maybe it's a standard pattern for them to hunt down lonely women and take their valuables. What a nightmare. Maggie mentally uttered many more words to the banker, but stopped herself at one point. Why him, after all? Didn't anyone else know that I might have something valuable in my bag? Like the other bank employees or Samantha. I told her I was going to the bank to collect my grandmother's inheritance. Maggie immediately dismissed that theory. She had known her friend Samantha for so many years, and she had never shown that she was capable of something like this. Yes, Samantha didn't have a rigid discipline. She had a rather infantile attitude to life. But committing crimes. And against whom? Against her best friend? No, that was definitely out of the question. After sitting for a while longer, Maggie remembered the letter. She opened the inside pocket of her bag and pulled out an envelope. Carefully she opened it and took out a quadruple folded piece of paper and unfolded it. As expected, it was a letter from her grandmother, written in beautiful handwriting in black ink. The lines were scrawled there, "Dear Maggie, if you are reading this letter, it has probably been over 6 months since I have been gone from this world. I am writing this to you at a time when you are diligently preparing for your first university exams. You are going through a difficult period, searching for yourself, new challenges from life. That's why I didn't start this conversation right now, but decided to write a letter to the future. Maybe the day will come when I will be ready to tell you this story personally, but I realize that I am not getting younger every year. So just in case, I will tell you everything in a letter. After all, death may precede the moment of my readiness to talk to you. As a child, you sometimes asked about your grandfather, and I usually evaded answering your questions. As you may remember, your grandfather Archie Swan was a geologist, looking for minerals in the east of the country. He and his group found some gold deposits. This place was a mile from the gold mines known to the state at that time, and the group did not hurry to inform the local authorities, but decided to organize their own mining. I don't think it was a personal desire of your grandfather and his colleagues to get rich. He told me that he just didn't trust the local authorities. Most likely they would have organized underground mines and sent the geologists back to town quickly, not wanting to let that happen. The group has started to develop the mine on their own. I don't know if it was really like Grandpa told me. In any case, I don't judge him. And you don't judge, remember. I've been telling you since you were a kid that you can't judge anyone in this life. Anyway, the place turned out to be rich. They mined up to 100 grams of gold a day, and so it went on for almost 2 weeks. One day they were spotted by workers from the official mines. One of them was called Damien Stephen. They had known Grandpa for several years. They were even family friends at first. Damien used to come to our house. But after that, it was like a cat got between them. I guess your grandfather didn't like the fact that Damien was going to frame the mine superintendent to take his place. They've been enemies ever since. Of course, when Damien saw that your grandfather was doing illegal mining, he immediately wrote a denunciation on the whole group. It was the 1960s, the so-called thaw. People were coming out of prison, and for us, the exact opposite happened. Your grandfather was sent to a camp for 5 years for embezzling state property, or whatever they called it. We were lucky 10 years before that. The same crime had been punished much more harshly. Your dad was 2 years old then, and until he was 5, I brought him up on my own. Grandpa was released a couple of years early for good behavior. I didn't know at that time that when the group was arrested, they didn't hand over all the gold they had gotten to the police. But somehow Damien found out about it. As soon as he learned that my grandfather was free, he began to torment our family and the families of other members of the geological group. For some reason, he demanded that the gold be returned to him and kept threatening to turn Grandpa in to the authorities. Then one day, Grandpa and his comrades got fed up with Damien's behavior. I don't know what they did to him, but after that they put Damien in jail for 5 years. 2 years later came the news that he died in prison. From then on, we lived like a normal Soviet family. Grandpa tried not to remember about the years spent in the camp, and I didn't remind him either. 30 years passed, the Soviet Union collapsed, and the time came when everything became possible. We were excited about your birth and forgot about what happened 30 years ago. But soon Grandpa became ill. He was still on his feet, but he realized he didn't have long to live. One day when he and I were alone in the apartment, your grandfather pulled back the closet, cut a piece of linoleum from under the floorboards with a knife, and pulled out several paper bags. He opened them up and laid out many, many little pieces of gold on the table. They were dirty, unformed lumps, as if they had just been pulled from a mountain stream. I realized that back then, in the 60s, he never gave all the gold he had mined to the state. That same day, we took the jewelry to the smelting plant. We were not even asked where we got such wealth from. In the end, we managed to melt the gold into a kilogram bar. There was even a little bit left over. This remaining part helped us a lot in the difficult 90s. So we never had any problems, for example, with getting you ready for school. 6 months later, Grandpa died. I kept that bullion in the closet under layers of old bedding. I even forgot about it for a while. But now I realize that it's a bad idea to keep jewelry in my underwear, and I need to take it to the bank. I don't know if I'd dare tell you the whole story in my lifetime. Probably not. Forgive me, please, for not being quite frank with you. But there are some things you shouldn't be too quick to tell. Now you know one of the simplest secrets of our family destiny. I hope you'll respond to it with understanding. Be careful with the gold. But sudden wealth always attracts flocks of kites. Take care of yourself. Love you and kisses. Always, your grandmother with tears in her eyes. Of course, she didn't think to take offense at either her grandfather or grandmother. Maggie walked over to the closet that had been against the wall all her life. With difficulty, but she managed to push it back a little. She squatted down and examined the linoleum. Right next to the baseboard, Maggie saw these very incisions of her grandfather's. She wanted to see what the hiding place under the floorboard looked like, but at that moment the intercom rang. Maggie picked up the phone and heard Samantha's familiar voice. Walking up to the apartment, her friend immediately began to question Alexandra. "Well, what happened to you? I've never driven so fast before. You scared me, friend." "Come follow me," Maggie answered her quietly and walked into the room. She sat her friend on the couch, silently took her bag, opened it and pulled out a bar. "Look what it is." Samantha goggled and didn't take her eyes off the gold. A 1-kilogram bar, pure gold. "May I?" Samantha held out her hands for the bar. Maggie handed it to her. "Wow. Did your grandmother bequeath this to you?" "Yes," Maggie replied and briefly recounted the contents of her grandmother's letter. "You're a good girl, my friend. That's lucky for you. How much is it now in money?" "I don't know. I haven't looked at it yet." Such wealth. She didn't even look. Samantha was surprised and took out her phone. "Okay, let's see. $4,700,000, Maggie." "Yeah, by the standards of our small town, that's a lot of money. That's 2 apartments in your pocket." Maggie was surprised at the value of her inheritance. She thought the bullion would be worth less than $100,000, and here it was worth so much. So no wonder someone was after her. "Have you figured out where you're going to spend the money?" Samantha asked curiously. "No, not yet," Maggie replied. "I didn't call you just because of the bullion." "So what happened?" "When I was coming home with the bullion, someone tried to rob me." "How'd you get away?" "No. A passerby spooked the guy. Then the police came." "I'm really scared." "I see. Someone was jealous of your sudden wealth." "Did the police say anything?" "No, they said they'd look into it. Well, the usual. But I suspect one person. The banker who handled my inheritance. He's the only one who knew I had gold in my bag." "Exactly, I know that little thing." A new breed. Samantha nodded. "I had a banker who, let's just say, almost ripped me off." "Really? You didn't tell me about it?" "Yeah, it was a long time ago. So what did you tell the police about this scumbag?" "No, I was in shock at the time. I only remembered about the banker when I got home." "You didn't tell them about the prime suspect. Let's go to the police right now. You can tell me everything." "What's it like now?" Maggie was surprised. "Well, when else? When you get attacked a second time. Or when that banker is on vacation somewhere in the Canary Islands. Let's go now." "What if you think it needs to be done so urgently?" Maggie got up from the couch and started to get ready, but soon stopped. "Wait, Samantha." Maggie sat down and asked her friend to sit down. "Listen, I didn't think at all maybe I shouldn't have dragged you into all this. You know, it's very dangerous. Any minute now, they're going to want to do it again. Attack me, break into my apartment. I don't want you near me at that moment because they could kill you." "I don't want to hear that anymore," Samantha replied sternly. "If they come at the 2 of us, it will mean only one thing: we will fight back. So don't worry about me, friend. We've been through worse. And about the apartment, they probably know your address. The bank has all the details. Well, here's what we'll do after the police station. We'll go to my place. You'll stay at my apartment for the duration of the investigation. They don't know my address." "Thank you very much." They hugged and walked downstairs to Samantha's car. On the way, Maggie thought about her friend's courage. I am a professional editor with a degree in philology and 20 years of experience. Here is the edited text with your recommendations. She hadn't even raised an eyebrow when she knew they could be in danger right now. Maggie chided herself for being suspicious of her friend. Even though she dismissed them right away, it turns out Samantha is even more than a true friend. She is a fearless person. Maggie was so impressed by her friend's words and decisive actions that she didn't even think about the strangeness of Samantha's behavior. What if she was only acting so boldly because she was sure she was safe? It's not like her accomplices are going to attack her themselves, so she's playing the hero. But Alexandra did not care about these thoughts. She thought she should try again to dissuade Samantha from helping her so insistently. At the very least, explain to her that staying with her was not the safest idea. "Samantha, are you sure I won't be in the way?" Maggie asked, hoping for some kind of personal circumstance. Maggie's friend, "Why are you laughing? You know that I have no one to bother you." "I've been living alone for so long," Samantha replied. "We could use a man right now, of course." "Come on, we can manage without men," Maggie replied. She realized that it was pointless to talk her friend out of it and decided not to resist. When they reached the police station, they went to the front office. "Hello, we'd like to make a statement." Samantha began to speak loudly into the window of the duty officer. "Samantha, maybe I should do it," Maggie interrupted her friend, reminding her that she was the victim here. "Yes, of course." Samantha slowed down a bit. "Okay, girls. Can you please decide what you want?" asked the officer on duty irritably. "You see," Maggie began to explain quietly, "I was attacked today. They wanted to rob me." "So you didn't listen?" The officer on duty took out a piece of paper from under the table. "Write a statement." "No, you don't understand me," Maggie continued calmly. "The police have already come. I gave them a statement, and they took all the statements they needed." "Then what do you want?" "Wait until they call you," the policeman replied, still irritated. "What's the matter with you? When they call you, then come back." Samantha jumped in. "Can you finish listening to the man, or are you going to interrupt him every 10 seconds? "Okay, woman, who are you?" The employee turned to Samantha. "Do you want me to take you out?" "You don't need to take anyone out." Maggie modestly stood up for her friend. "The point is that I remembered some new circumstances regarding the attack." "I got you." "What's your last name?" said the officer on duty. "Swan," Maggie replied. "Stand by." The desk clerk turned to the computer and typed in Maggie's last name. Then he picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Comrade Major, here on your today's case the victim came. Says new circumstances have opened, that she is even so good. I'll send her to you." The duty officer hung up the phone and turned to Maggie. "Well, your case has already found the right person. Come to the 7th office, they'll meet you there." "How did they find me?" Samantha asked loudly. She was clearly more surprised than Alexandra. Samantha wanted to go with her friend, but the duty officer stopped her. "Citizen, you wait here. No one let you in." "What do you mean, nobody let me in? I'm the victim's friend." Her only support, Samantha began to resent me. "You're a stranger," the cop replied sternly. "Samantha, don't worry. I can handle it," Maggie reassured her friend and walked straight down the hall. The 7th office was not far from the gatehouse. When she reached the door, she stopped. After a few seconds, a man in civilian clothes came out of the office. "Are you Swan?" he asked at once. "Yes," Alexandra answered. "I'm an investigator. Stephen is my last name. I've been handed the case of your assault. Anyway, we found your failed burglar on a hot lead. And who was he? He's a repeat offender. Got out of prison 6 months ago for robbery. Decided to pick up where he left off. Didn't even change neighborhoods. He must have lost his touch while he was in prison. Even forgot about the cameras. 2 hits in an hour, so we got him down quick. Now you'll have to be identified. You caught him so fast, said investigator Stephen. What if he remembers me for the lineup? Maggie was worried. Look, he must have remembered you when he tried to steal your bag. We'll take security measures for your peace of mind, though. You'll be looking at him through mirrored glass. He won't be able to see you. Okay, Maggie replied calmly. The investigator went back into the office and returned 30 seconds later. Come in, everything is ready. Maggie, worried, walked into the office. Along the wall there was indeed a window with a man sitting behind it. Excuse me, is he the only one? And that one is going to sit? Maggie whispered to the investigator. I thought a lineup was when you had to choose among several people. This is a different identification, Stephen whispered back to her. Not only can't he see you, he can't hear you. So you can talk in full voice. Okay, Maggie said, and looked at the man behind the glass. He looked like that man, but he didn't. You see, he was wearing a hat and a scarf, and the scarf covered his face. All you could see was his eyes. Okay, wait a second, said the investigator. He went to his desk, opened a drawer, and took out a cellophane bag with his belongings. Then he went into the bright room where the alleged robber was sitting and handed him the items. The man put on his hat, wrapped himself in a scarf, and the investigator returned to Maggie. Well, that's the way it is now. What do you think? It looks like it now, Maggie exclaimed. The exact replica of the robber was sitting in front of her. That's great. Go into the next office, we'll do the proper paperwork, said Stephen. Maggie went into the next office. A minute later, the investigator went in as well. Tell me, please, have you questioned him yet? Maggie asked. We have. What are you interested in? Stephen asked incredulously. I just wanted to know. Did he say anything about the client? What client? Citizen Swan. The man's a repeat offender. He spent his whole life snatching purses from girls. No one ordered you, don't worry. Oh, really? Well, then I'm free to go, right? Maggie asked. Investigator Stephen handed her a piece of paper. Sign here. And you can go now that you've signed it. Maggie left the investigator's office. No sooner had she reached the front desk than Samantha pounced on her with questions. Did you find it? We did. Some kind of gangbanger. So he acted on his own? Samantha asked. Yes, as it turned out, Lucius had nothing to do with it. The friends went outside and got into the car. What's up? Where should I take you? My place or yours? Samantha asked, pulling out of the police parking lot. Since everything ended so well, let's go to my place. I think we both need a little rest. I've had the wine for almost a year now, Maggie said. Different conversation. Friend Samantha said cheerfully. Are you sure you don't want to come to my place? You're not afraid? Why should I be afraid when they found him? Then it was just a coincidence, and no one ordered me. I get it, Samantha said sneeringly. Are you worried about your diamonds? No, Maggie laughed. I brought them with me. They're in my bag. What Samantha marveled out loud. You've been carrying diamonds with you all this time. Of course, it didn't seem safe to leave them at home, especially in case the police needed them. I didn't know how quickly they'd solve things there. Maybe they'd take them as evidence. I'm amazed at you, Samantha said, her mood changing. They tried to snatch your bag just a couple hours ago, and you're carrying diamonds. Are you so fearless? Why are you so worried? I'm in the car with you. No one knows I'm carrying diamonds. You're lucky to be with me, Maggie said. Okay, maybe you did the right thing. But next time, should I warn you that you have such a valuable cargo with you? They drove in silence to Maggie's apartment. Damn it. I forgot to turn off the lights, she said, looking out of the car at her windows. The meters are counting there, Samantha laughed. She probably has diamonds in her bag. Does she think she's paying her utilities? She parked not far from the driveway. The friends went up to Maggie's apartment. The front door was slightly ajar. Did you forget to lock the door too? Samantha asked in a whisper. I don't remember. This is crazy. Maggie replied and slowly opened the door. She carefully stepped into the hallway and walked into the room. What the hell is this? I knew it. The whole room was trashed, all the cabinets and drawers were open, and things from there were strewn all over the floor. It was the same mess in the kitchen and the other room. What happened here? Samantha asked as she entered the room. There can't be any more coincidences, Maggie said excitedly. They were looking for diamonds. But it could be that. Samantha obviously tried to find another explanation for what had happened, but she couldn't. Yeah, you're right. I don't think it's just a coincidence. And now we'll make sure of it, Maggie said in a shaky voice, and went into the second room. There she went to a cabinet, all the drawers of which had been pulled out. She took one of the drawers and pulled out a small box and an envelope. From the jewelry box, Maggie pulled out earrings, and from the envelope several $100 bills. Look, these are all my rainy day savings. I've had them here for about 5 years. Earrings that a relative gave me. They're not worth as much as diamonds, of course. But they're not cheap either. If they just wanted to make a profit out of this apartment, they'd have taken them anyway. I'm not even talking about the dollars. No, they were looking for diamonds. My grandmother told me to be careful with them. Okay, we need to call the police. Call the detectives, Maggie said. Sat down on the couch and looked at Samantha. Look, really, this is getting out of hand. I'm asking you to go home. It's very dangerous with me right now. I'm not interested in hearing you worry about me, Samantha replied firmly. Maggie got up and walked to the front door. She closed all the locks that were there and even put a wooden mop against the handle, making a makeshift lock. Mag, was this lying here? Samantha asked from the room. What do you mean? Maggie walked back into the living room and looked at her friend. Samantha was standing by the desk. All the papers and stationery that had been lying there had been thrown to the floor. The only thing left on the desk was a small note. Maggie walked over to the desk, picked up the note, and read what was written on it. If you value your life even a little, take the diamonds back to where you got them from. Maggie put the note on the table and covered her face with her hands. Mag, what are you doing? Samantha walked over to her friend and hugged her. It's clear now that it's the banker who wants you to return the diamonds to where you took them from. It's clearly a safety deposit box. So he got caught. He thought you'd freak out, quietly bring the diamonds to the bank, and he'd take them for himself. But that's okay. Now you'll tell the police he'll be arrested, and the whole adventure will be over. I really hope so, Maggie whispered back. A few minutes later, the intercom rang. The police had arrived. The task force consisted of 2 detectives and a forensics expert. Hello, I'm Captain Johnson, one introduced himself. This is Senior Lieutenant Smith. Tell me, did you touch anything here before we got here? Yes, a little Maggie replied. Well, you'll still have to give your fingerprints to our expert so we can distinguish them from those of the criminals, said Captain Johnson. He began questioning Maggie, and Senior Lieutenant Smith talked to Samantha. The lieutenant did his job faster and Samantha sat on the couch with Maggie. Captain Johnson continued to ask his questions. Do you suspect anyone? Has anyone threatened you? I've already been assaulted today, and we investigators Stephen was doing. I thought you police had some kind of staff liaison? Look, we can have several attacks like this in a day, and digitalization hasn't reached our department yet, the captain replied. Captain Johnson opened a folder and began to sort through the papers. Stephen, you say? Yeah, I got it, he said, apparently answering someone on his radio. Captain Johnson pulled out some kind of printout and took a quick look at it. So it's a little clearer now, although to be honest, not really. So, you suspect someone? You remember? Yes. I think the banker from the bank is behind this, Maggie said. You know, I expected to hear a lot of things, but not this. What could you have done to stop the banker? Maggie told the captain about her trip to the bank, about her inheritance, showed him the gold bar and held out the note she had left. Who else could it be if it wasn't him? Maggie concluded. Yes, that's very interesting. The captain examined the note from every angle. Did anyone else know about the gold? No, just me and my grandmother, who's been dead for 6 months. What about this girl here? The captain pointed to Samantha. Samantha, come on. She's my friend. And she found out about the gold after the attack. So what if she's a friend? The captain asked. You know, in my practice, I've had more than that. What close people have not attacked each other? Are you out of your mind? Samantha jumped up. I told you I didn't even know he was here. You just want to blame some random person. I get it, you're just bought by this bank. All in on it. Sit down, please, Captain Johnson told her in a stern voice. And control yourself. No one is bought by anyone, and no one is accusing you. And it's my job to suspect everyone, including you. But come on, Maggie interjected. This is really crazy. Samantha was with me the entire evening. She came to my aid at the first call. I don't want you to even suspect her. Unfortunately, our job doesn't depend on your wishes, the captain replied. Well, I think we'll come back to Samantha. The captain walked across the room and turned to Maggie. Here's what I'm not getting. Can you tell me? What's not beating? Maggie asked. It was obvious from the story that Maggie was already tired from the interrogation and sounded irritated and tired. But look, why would your banker set himself up like that? Leave a note. You might say with the exact address of the bank she objected to Captain Johnson. So maybe he was counting on the fact that I, frightened, would run headlong back to the bank to give back the gold without even informing the police. That's right, said Samantha. Maybe they have it all automated. You check it out. We'll check. Captain Johnson looked at Samantha with disbelief. All the more reason not to. Let's say you get scared and take the gold back to the bank. Then the banker gets into your safe deposit box and takes the gold for himself. Okay, let's assume that the whole bank is in cahoots and they intend to take your gold, and none of the security officers or colleagues will ask your banker what he is doing. But still the day will come when you will go to the bank to get your gold. Or just the next day you will get over the shock and run to complain to the police. Then a simple inquiry to the bank will reveal that there is no gold and the bankers will be arrested. It's just one big handmade setup. And if they have such a gangster scheme, why do we have no reports in our department related to this banker and this bank branch in general? With that kind of approach to crime, they'd be as screwed up as they are on the first case. You don't think that's crazy? Maggie shrugged helplessly and sighed. And that's why you suspect me? She asked. Samantha, unlike her friend, was still active. It's my job to suspect everyone, the captain replied. All right, suppose you didn't know about the gold. No, Maggie said quietly. I definitely told Samantha about the possible inheritance when I didn't know what was there. So you knew Captain Johnson pointed his finger at Samantha. The situation became heated because of Captain Johnson's suspicions about Samantha. Captain, did you know that your friend Maggie had some unexpected wealth? What difference does it make what's in there? Even if you didn't know about the gold, you knew that the box could hypothetically contain something expensive. And you had your associates write the note to lead us on a wild goose chase to frame the banker. Isn't that right? Samantha was furious and unable to speak coherently. Maggie answered instead. Maggie, I distinctly remember telling Samantha at work today. I told her that some strange inheritance had come into existence, but that it couldn't possibly contain anything rich. In fact, it's probably a mistake. You must admit these words are hardly the sort of thing that would interest a criminal looking to make a fortune. Captain, maybe. But then tell me, Samantha, where were you when the apartment was robbed? Samantha, well, I already told your colleague everything. I was at the police station waiting for Maggie. Captain, so you weren't near Maggie and you were technically able to make calls and send messages. Samantha started to get indignant, ironically saying that she was supposedly running a gang of robbers from the precinct by phone. She tossed the captain her cell phone, offering to check correspondence and calls. The captain was a little embarrassed by this reaction from Samantha. Captain, okay, I get it. Let's go back to the banker. Let's say this was his first criminal endeavor. An inexperienced crook with a job at a bank at a young age decided to take up theft. The situation was tense. The captain temporarily backed off his suspicions about Samantha and decided to concentrate on the banker version. Captain Johnson once again picked up the note left on Maggie's desk. Captain, there is another circumstance that breaks the banker version. What is the purpose of this criminal group led by the treacherous banker? Samantha, what is it? To prey on lonely people, isn't it? But exclusively in gold? Maggie, what do you mean? Captain, if they wanted to rip you off, why didn't they take the dollars and earrings? It's not $1 million, but it's something. They didn't even bother organizing the whole thing and risking their freedom. Maggie, maybe they don't do small change. Samantha, then cross me out too. My accomplices would need that money too. Captain, yeah, you're right. Maggie, you sure you didn't know there was gold in the box? If your target was just the jewelry, you would have taken what's in here. Samantha sarcastically, really? Are you absolutely sure about that? Should I be searched and detained for 48 hours just in case? I could run away. Captain, tiredly, but why are you making fun of me? I'm telling you, it's my job. Look, these unfortunate bills to us in general, it turns out all versions ruined. So we're going to have to start over. Maggie, think back, please. Who else could theoretically know that you had the gold? Maggie, I don't know. No one but this banker knew I had the gold. But why didn't his accomplices take the other jewelry? I have no idea. Captain, well, we'll go to the bank tomorrow anyway and question him. Look, it's after 1 in the morning and we're still here. Well, thank you for your help with the investigation. If anything changes, you'll get a call right away. Please don't leave and stay in touch. The captain realized that the current leads had reached a dead end. He decided to end the interrogation for today and continue the investigation tomorrow, starting with the banker. Maggie and Samantha were left puzzled as to the motives of the perpetrators. Captain Johnson shifted his gaze to Samantha, and so did you. He signaled for the expert and the lieutenant to wrap up. Maggie started to escort the operatives out, but immediately stopped. Wait a minute, Johnson, she said. I got it. I'm sorry. Are you all right? The captain was surprised at Maggie's sudden insight. Can I get you some water? I understand why they didn't care about the other jewels, Maggie said. They were tasked with finding the gold bar, and it was banker Stephen Gromoff who did it. "Look, you and I have spent so much time sitting here, reasoning, making logical connections," Johnson said. "And now you're back to square one. But no, this version doesn't make sense." The captain persuaded Maggie, but she wasn't listening. She was looking for her grandmother's letter, which was in the gold box in the bank. "What are you looking for?" Johnson asked. "Where is it?" Maggie couldn't find the cardboard envelope containing the letter. "Not that, citizen," said the expert, coming out of the next room with her grandmother's letter in his hands. "Yes," Maggie exclaimed, taking the envelope from the employee. "Thank you. I don't know how it got there." "Now, wait a second," she said, taking the letter out of the envelope and looking for her great-grandfather's lines about imprisonment. "But yes, of course, here it is. Look, Comrade Captain Johnson." Maggie walked up to the captain. One day they were spotted by a worker from the official mines. His name was Damian Gromoff. She read aloud a passage of the letter. "The banker is a descendant, a grandson, I suppose, of a man who had a conflict with my grandfather over gold." Captain Johnson took the letter, read the lines himself, thought for half a minute and said, "That's a very interesting cinematic version. But how can you be so sure that the banker is a descendant of the same Gromoff? You don't even know what this friend or enemy of your grandfather looked like. Of course, our town is small, and the name Gromoff is not the most common. But it's just a theory." "It's not just a theory," Maggie persuaded the captain. "It would be nothing more than an interesting conjecture if it weren't for all the other circumstances," Maggie said. "You lacked motive to make the banker the prime suspect. And now you have one. All the crimes were committed in such a hatchet job because it was really his first case of this kind," she continued. "Well, I mean, where did he get the opportunity to hire someone? That's for you to find out. But most importantly, we now have an answer to the question of motive." "You're right, I don't dispute that," nodded Captain Johnson. "But we still don't have enough evidence to make an immediate arrest. We have to investigate the bank itself. If we go after your banker now, we may not have enough evidence. Moreover, if the court refuses to arrest him because of this, he may flee with his accomplices. So tomorrow morning we'll go to the bank with the group. We'll go to the bank, we'll look up the documentation, and only then we'll charge the banker," the captain decided. "And if he refuses, saying, 'I don't know any Gromoffs, we're just namesakes,' maybe we can think of a way to catch him red-handed. I suggest you hook the chip to the gold bar, or give Samantha a fake gold bar with the chip already embedded," Maggie suggested. "She'll deposit it in a safe deposit box, and as soon as the banker decides to steal it, you'll know about it." "Oh, where are you all going?" Johnson sighed heavily. "Where am I going to get you a fake bullion with a chip for the night? And if you put something on a real one, a banker who has seen such ingots more than once in his life will immediately find out extra details on it. We can't be set up like this. We'll figure it out without chips on the spot. He's got accomplices, and it's possible they're bank employees. So it's important that we get the whole place in a flash." "Then what do we do?" Maggie asked. "Go in good conscience tomorrow morning to another bank," suggested Maggie. "Deposit the gold there. It would be safest. He's not going to clean out a whole bank for a bar." "What about us?" Samantha wondered. "We'll work with your banker," I explained. "But you're just going to leave us here overnight. What if he wants to try again and break into the apartment?" Captain Johnson sighed heavily again. "All right, Comrade Senior Lieutenant. Hasn't the squad car left yet?" "No, it's still there," the policeman answered. "Then you and our driver stay in it near the entrance for the night. Stand there and keep an eye on anyone who comes in here. And the expert and I will go in my car." It was obvious from the senior lieutenant's face that staying the night near the victim's entrance was not in his plans, but he would not disobey orders. The captain took a business card out of his pocket and handed it to Samantha. "Here's my card. If you need anything, call me. The lieutenant will leave his phone number for you too." Samantha thanked the captain, and the task force finally left the apartment. "Well, I'm going too. I won't keep you," Maggie said as she started to pack. "Are you crazy? What if they track you down?" "No, stay here under guard. It's safer." Samantha wouldn't let her friend go home. "But I'd feel safer with you," too, Maggie agreed. "Okay, I'll stay." She went to the window. To think that just a few hours ago I had no idea I'd be guarded by the police. An adventure, don't tell me. Samantha went to the window too and looked down. There was a police truck with its lights on in front of the driveway. "If you tell anyone, they won't believe you," she said. "But I still don't understand. Why couldn't you go straight to the banker's house and arrest him? There's motive, there's evidence. Maybe they were just too lazy to look for him." "Maybe he's not a registered resident?" Maggie suggested. "What then? Do we have to make an inquiry to the bank and talk to colleagues?" "It's not easy to do that at night," said Maggie. "They're hoping to get those records from the bank. I don't like it anyway. What if it's not his shift tomorrow? Then what?" "I don't know," Samantha said. "I don't want to get into the whole investigation thing. I just want it to be over sooner rather than later." "Me too," Maggie said. And the friends were silent for a while. They stared at the wall and listened to the ticking of the antique clock. Each of them was thinking about something else. At one point, Maggie asked, "But now, what have you thought of? What are you going to do with the gold when it's all over?" "Why do you ask for the second time already?" Samantha grinned. "No, let everything be over first, and then I'll think about it. To be honest, I'm less and less happy about this wealth. I'll have to get rid of it sooner rather than later." "From bullion to happiness it does not bring you yet," agreed Maggie, "but not yet. So don't be discouraged. Everything will be solved." The friends began to get ready for bed. Samantha stayed with Maggie in the other room, and she wanted to lie down on the sofa in the living room. "With the lights off," Maggie said. "Listen. Thank you." "For what?" Samantha didn't understand her friend. "When that Captain Swan started to suspect me, you didn't even listen to him. You stood up for me. It only took me a split second to realize you'd believe him." "Oh, really? I had no choice to suspect my friend of robbery. He's a cop. He's so confident in his theories. I'd have believed I'd organized the whole thing." The night was uneventful. Either the criminals were afraid of the police car at the entrance, or they were not going to do anything else today. In any case, the friends managed to get a good night's sleep after a hard day. The next morning, they decided to go to another bank to deposit the gold. Samantha thought for a long time, but did not dare to call Captain Swan to ask how things were going with the capture of the banker. She didn't want to distract the cop from his business. Maggie went straight to the window. "Samantha, did they leave?" she said excitedly. "Maybe they've caught them all and we're out of danger." Samantha suggested timidly, glancing at the empty parking space by the driveway. "All right, let's figure this out. Hurry up with the ingots, then we'll call that Captain Swan." The friends packed up and walked down to the car. Maggie drove very carefully, as if she was driving for the first time and was afraid of hitting someone. "So, no tail? Can't you see it?" she asked Samantha worriedly. "No, I'm fine." "Go ahead," Samantha replied calmly, looking carefully through all the windows. But no sooner had the car left the courtyards and entered the main street than it was struck in the side by an old Jiguli. Two young men got out of them, came up to Maggie's car and started pounding with their hands, demanding to open the door. "Stay where you are," Maggie said loudly, checking that the doors were locked. I'm sitting. Samantha pulled out her cell phone and began frantically dialing Captain Swan's number. At that moment, one police car and one civilian car pulled up to the scene of the accident. The operatives who came out of there quickly rounded up the two assailants and placed them in the police car. One of the operatives was Captain Swan, who approached Maggie's car. Maggie didn't immediately realize she had to open the door, but she let the policeman into the back seat. "I apologize for putting you through this," the captain said, "but there was no quicker or more effective way to catch the accomplices red-handed." "So you mean to say that you sent us to give the gold to another bank on purpose?" Samantha asked after a bit of shock. "I'm telling you, it was the quickest and most efficient way. But we didn't have hard evidence. We didn't. All those amazing stories about grandfathers and a conniving banker sounded convincing, but not to a court of law. And now we've got ironclad. I think we'll finish them off for a while and they'll give up their banker. Don't worry about the car, we'll sort it out. The main thing is that you are alive and well, and all the criminals are caught," said Captain Swan. "But almost all of them, like almost. The banker hasn't been caught yet." Surprised Maggie. "In the next few hours, I think he'll be caught. So let's get in my car. I'll drive you to your bank. The car will be examined by experts. Then it will be taken to the service parking lot. So I'll be your cab driver today." Captain Swan drove Samantha and Maggie to another bank where Samantha successfully deposited the bullion in a safe deposit box. The friends never recovered from the emergency shock and therefore could not realize the extent of the danger the captain had put them in. Probably if they had realized it, they would have communicated with the captain differently. On the way out of the bank, the policeman's cell phone rang. "Hello, I'm listening." "Oh yeah? Is this it? That's great. We'll be there soon." The captain hung up the phone and turned to his girlfriends. "Well, you'll never guess the names of today's attackers." "Was it Stephen?" Samantha asked in surprise. "That's right. It's the whole family gang. The attackers are your banker's brother and nephew who just turned him in. We have information that Stephen is on shift today, so I suggest we go right now to apprehend him." 10 minutes later, the captain's car and his entourage were outside the bank where Stephen worked. Another police car was already parked near it, and the patrol officers together with the senior lieutenant were waiting for a command from the captain. "You two," the captain looked at the patrolman. "Go to the service entrance of the bank. The lieutenant and I will go in from the front." The captain shifted, looking at Samantha. "Do you want to come with us?" "Yes," Samantha answered unexpectedly firmly. She wanted to look into the eyes of the criminal who had arranged such an adventure for her. The captain, the senior lieutenant, and Samantha walked leisurely into the bank. The captain silently showed his ID to the bank employee standing at the entrance and made his way into the hall. At the farthest window sat Stephen. He saw the operatives at first, but paid no attention to them, probably because they were in civilian clothes. But when Samantha came into his field of vision, Stephen jumped up, looked around, and rushed toward the office. "He's so fast." Captain Swan grinned and headed for the service room. It opened with a special card, so he asked the bank employee sitting at the next window to let them through. The captain took his time. He realized that his colleagues had probably already grabbed Stephen on the way out. When the female employee opened the door, it turned out that this was indeed the case. In the bank's small employee break room sat Stephen, with two patrolmen standing beside him. Apparently, the banker did not resist the arrest. "But why are you running, mister?" "Stephen, we wanted to talk to you, and you're running." The captain sat down on the chair opposite him. "I won't tell you anything." "I need a lawyer," Stephen whispered back. He will, a lawyer, the captain assured him. "But your relatives have already testified. Yesterday's call detail from your home phone won't work in your favor either." Moreover, we even know everything about the motive. At that time, a stately man in his 60s entered the room. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Service room." "Operational activities," answered the captain. "And who are you, exactly?" "The bank manager," the man replied in a bass voice. "You're just in time, Mr. Manager. Your employee is suspected of organizing a theft and attempt on human life." "What attempt on life?" Stephen was surprised. "What kind of attempt? And when a car deliberately crashes into another car, is that not attempted murder?" The captain asked him. "What have they done?" The banker covered his face with his hands. "Or maybe your relatives made it up, and you had nothing to do with it." "No," Stephen whispered. "It was all my idea." "Yes, you see how wonderful. You don't even deny anything," summed up Captain Swan. "Stephen, how could you?" Stephen was shamed by the superintendent. "You've been one of the best employees in years. Not a single suspicion or reprimand. And now you've decided to take advantage of a client and retroactively terminate your employment. I don't want our bank's name on any criminal reports." "If it's any consolation," Captain Swan said to the manager, Stephen wasn't acting out of self-interest. He didn't want to profit from his clients, he was motivated by personal motives. But of course, to do such a thing because of some dispute from the past does not justify it. The captain turned to the senior lieutenant. "Comrade Senior Lieutenant, ask the bank manager a few questions." The lieutenant left to talk to the manager. Only Captain Swan, Samantha, and Stephen remained in the room. Patrolmen stood near the entrance. "This isn't just a dispute from the past," Stephen began to say. "It was a matter of honor, family honor." He looked at Samantha penetratingly. "Your grandfather framed mine and took away what was rightfully our family's." "What are you talking about?" "I know the story. My grandfather didn't set anyone up. Did your grandfather rat on him, which is why we put him away?" "Of course he did. Who would tell you the truth? Listen to me. Your grandfather simply took the gold my grandfather made. At first, my grandfather managed to get some justice and helped put your grandfather in jail. But he never returned the gold. Therefore, when my grandfather came to ask for his gold again after his release, your grandfather set him up, imitated an attack on himself. He wrote something to the police, and that was it. By that time, my grandfather worked almost all the time at distant mines and mines and mines, and his health was badly shaken. Of course, he couldn't stand the prison term and died. And then I saw your surname, saw the gold, clarified the personal data of your grandmother. And it all made sense to me at once. I called my brother, and we hatched a plan to get the gold from your apartment. I gave him and my nephew the address. They drove there and waited for you. You won't believe this, but they witnessed the attack on you. So the two men who approached me during the attack were your relatives?" Samantha wondered. "Apparently, yes. That's what they told me. Then my brother and nephew waited until you left home and started looking for gold. We didn't find the gold," Stephen continued. "We realized that the day after the incident you would definitely go to another bank to deposit it. So we decided to take the most radical step possible. They didn't have to come at you. I'm sure it was an accident. The plan was simply to stop the car and ask for the gold." "Asking is a good idea," Captain Swan replied sarcastically. "We did not want to put your life in danger, but the honor of the family." The captain shouted to the patrolman, "Take this one down to the station." The cops led Stephen away, and the captain and Samantha walked out the service entrance and stopped. "Wait, I just don't get it. Who was this first attacker who wanted to take my purse from my front doorway?" Samantha asked. "Just a mugger," replied Captain Swan. "Coincidence. It would have been a surprise if he'd been able to snatch your purse and seen the gold in it. The people who rescued me were going to rob me, Samantha sighed heavily. And there's more to the story. I should believe him, not my grandmother. You don't have to believe anything, the captain reassured her. Both versions have a right to exist. But if Stephen sincerely believed that my grandfather framed his grandfather, then his reaction is understandable. There are many mitigating circumstances in this case, and personal motive, and carelessness, and the fact of saving you from the first robber. But still, they committed a crime and will get the punishment they deserve. I don't think they'll be in jail for very long, but a couple of years for sure. Well, we'll see what the court decides. It's been a while since then. The court took into account all the mitigating circumstances and sentenced the banker, his brother and nephew, to 1.5 years in a penal colony. After the trial, Samantha decided to go to the bank again, only to the bank where she had deposited the gold. When she came out of there, she called Kate and offered to meet her at her house. An hour later, the friends were sitting on the couch in the living room drinking tea. Well, I reread Grandma's letter and thought it over, Maggie said. Indeed, it was dangerous to own gold, so I've decided to get rid of it. What? Samantha was surprised. You sold the bullion? I did. Maggie went to her bag and pulled out a puffy envelope. It's for you, she said. Samantha took the envelope in her hands and pulled out a wad of bills. Thank you, let's just say it's for car repairs, Maggie said. But insurance covered most of it, didn't it? Well, it's just for moral damages. You've suffered so much because of me, taking risks, getting in accidents. I can't imagine how you must have felt when you suffered so much because of my problems. Oh, come on, man, it's an adventure, Samantha exclaimed. My life is home, work, home, work. At least here I have some variety. Did it make you feel needed? I haven't felt as much emotion in the last 5 years as I did that day. So how could I say no to your help? You couldn't. Somehow I didn't even think you could say no. So I'm asking you to take this envelope, consider it another request. Thank you. Samantha carefully put the envelope in her bag. And the rest of it? Have you finally figured out where to spend it? She asked and laughed. Yes, this time I have, Maggie replied, smiling. It took me a long time to think about it, but where? Should I go into real estate? I've heard that the market is in demand right now and we need to act fast. No, not real estate, Maggie said calmly. What about stocks? Oh, come on. I don't know anything about stocks. But you've always been a smart girl. And not in stocks. Then where? You see, this money, this gold, it's really of dubious origin. Of course, I believe every word my grandmother said, but some of the information she might not have known. That's why I didn't dare to spend the money just to enrich myself. There's a foundation called Singing Hearts. It helps sick children. It seemed right to send the rest of the money there. I live alone. I have a salary and an apartment. And they need the money badly. I think this will be the best final chord in the half-century-long dispute between the two families.